I took the system to its maximum potential. I created the perfect system. The thing about perfection is that it's unknowable.
Bio-digital jazz. Ahoy, everyone. My name is Bobby Shortle, and I'm here with Nick Rocco Scalia, and we are the Intrepid Filmographers. Every mini-series, we chart a course through the full filmography of an under-discussed genre or journeyman filmmaker. In this expedition, we do our best to try and be explorers, using our years of film knowledge to help guide us, but always being open to discovering new things about the medium we love so much. Today, we kick off our debut adventure with the films of Joseph Kosinski and his very first film, Tron Legacy. Nick, how you doing, my friend?
I'm doing really good. Very excited to be here. Bio-digital jazz is... You said that, and I forgot that was part of the movie for a second there, and I was like, wow, we're really riffing now. But no, now I get where you're going with that.
I had forgot it was part of the movie as well until he said it. That phrase has been... I've said that phrase many times as like a joke with friends of mine, and then when Jeff Bridges said it in this 2010 film, Tron Legacy, I was like, oh my God, this is where it's from.
You have friends that would get that reference, though? That's pretty cool. I definitely don't.
Yes, for sure. Well,
we have mutual friends. Maybe we're thinking of the same person.
Yeah, maybe Brian Verderosa, whose name will come up several times, probably on this recording, who's actually helping us produce this show and in the future, hopefully booking guests and all this other stuff. This is a movie podcast, if it wasn't obvious from the intro, and where Nick and I are going to be going through, like I said, the filmographies in miniseries form of directors. And we have a lot of directors lined up. The hope is that they are not directors that you have heard talked about many, many times on podcasts or in YouTube videos or wherever before. We're focusing on journeyman, like we said, genre and under-discussed filmmakers. Nick, you said pre-record, there's a little setup we have to do. When I say a journeyman filmmaker, what is sort of your definition? Because we should both talk about that to us, what that means.
Maybe I would define that as a filmmaker who is consistently working in a studio capacity. I mean, it is kind of a... I don't want to get into art and commerce just yet exactly, but these are filmmakers that are consistently working. They're not necessarily household names, but they are working. They are making movies that, like, maybe the movies are household names, like Tron Legacy and the rest of Joseph Kosinski's filmography. Like, a lot of those made a lot of money. People are familiar with them. People really like them. And yet, you don't necessarily go to a movie just because it's a Joseph Kosinski movie. Like, I will now. Because I've always been interested in directors. I don't know about you, but like growing up, I would have the Leonard Maltin movie guides and I would know these names like Taylor Hackford. And, they weren't necessarily, they're not your auteur filmmakers. They're not your Scorseses or your Quentin Tarantinos or whatever. But I would know these names and I'd go see a movie like, oh, Taylor Hackford. I know some other stuff that he's done. So hopefully we can kind of bring some attention to those films because you and I have both kind of, I wouldn't call us like industry people, but we know a little bit about the industry and we've made films before and we know how hard it is and just the fact that these people are making movies and they keep getting hired back to make movies. And I've always been an auteur theory guy, right? Like I do think the director imposes their stamp on a movie and we only talk about the ones that are like those household names, the ones where you see a film at the Coen brothers or something and it's a Coen brothers movie. But I definitely think we're going to see things and just in the little bit of Joseph Kosinski's filmography, which I think he was a good first choice. It was your idea, so I can give you credit for that.
Thank you very much.
I think there is definitely something to be said for a certain consistency in his work and a certain thematic and aesthetic and visual thing that he does that I think is just going to be really interesting to look at.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think neither one of us are working filmmakers, right? But I've worked in, the video business professionally for many, many years now. Ever since college, basically, I've been paid to be an editor and a producer on a lot of commercial and corporate stuff, some documentary stuff as well. And I went to film school. I think you went to film school as well, Nick. So it's like, we have that sort of working knowledge of the way movies work. But I think Nick and I have a mutual friend in common named Brian. They did a movie podcast together called Talking Movies, which kind of ran through this website, sort of like podcast network I had set up years ago, the Talking Comics sort of network. And that's how I came to know Nick. I quickly learned listening to that podcast. I was like, oh, Nick is the guy who thinks about movies kind of the way that I think about movies. And I think like it's going to be fun to talk about movies with you. And as early as I can remember is probably around the time where Scream came out, where I was like, wait, I love this movie. And there was like, it's directed by Wes Craven. And then the first time I was ever like, oh, but this guy also made the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. Like that's the first time I kind of started realizing it was possible for like that kind of thing to be a thing. And then I remember when I was in college, freshman in college, I was in the newspaper and I read a column about movies. And I tried to do this thing where I would be like, okay, here are the movies coming out. And here are the people, here are like the creative people behind the movie. And here are the other movies they've done. So this is why this movie is going to be good. I was wrong so many times. I was wrong way more times than I was right. But I gained a lot of knowledge of like, oh, this is the person who directed this movie. And now they're directing this movie. I started to learn like, oh, Tim Story is directing the Fantastic Four movie. He directed Taxi and Barbershop. I don't know if this is the right person to direct Fantastic Four. I had never thought about things that way. And so I think that since then in my life, I've been very focused on who makes the movies and how the movies get made.
This is the thing I think goes back a really long time, too. I mean, if you look back into the 60s and the 70s, the 80s, where, you know, we did, okay, I guess we're somewhat middle-aged. Let's say early middle-aged. Can we do that?
We can say that.
Like a lot of the filmmakers that we grew up with, or a lot of the films that we saw growing up, were made by these kind of studio filmmakers. And I think a lot of times, because I read so much film criticism, I've written film criticism. I mean, film criticism is like what taught me how to write. It taught me a lot of vocabulary. I grew up reading a lot of film journalism and music journalism, and, you know, really kind of defined who I was. And having read a lot of that, and there was this kind of disdain for those filmmakers, you know, because they weren't, like I said, I keep using the phrase household names, and these are just, you know, like hacks was a term that I remember seeing a lot. This idea that, you know, it's just someone who's cashing a paycheck, goes in there, tells the actors what to do, goes home at night, doesn't think about it. And like, I don't think that's true at all. And I think even this first episode of the show, this first film that we're going to talk about, I think there's a lot more than that going on here. And I think that, you know, who Joseph Kosinski is and what he's interested in and just the kind of way he approaches things. I mean, if you look at his early career, you can see a lot of that. Like, oh, okay, that's why you hire this guy to do Tron Legacy. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think we're kind of circling around diving into this miniseries beginning. But yes, absolutely. I think I did a lot of research and I've listened to like a lot of interviews with him now, Kosinski. And I think what we're going to find here, what I'm hoping we find here, right? Because this might not always be the case, right? Some of these people that we might discuss might fall into this stereotypical definition of what a journeyman is. But I think already from this research that I've done on this and listening to him talk, it's very clear that that is not who Joseph Kosinski was at the start of his career. We don't know as we progress through the 5 films that he's made, right? I don't know if that's going to adapt or change. Right. But in this first movie, and I think when we go to our next time for our second movie, especially, I think we're going to be seeing a little bit more of an auteurist. There's a little bit of an auteurist thing going on, I think, with him a little bit, which I think is going to be fascinating to see the evolution of his career. The other 2 pillars, obviously, said were genre, which, you know, we're talking about people who kind of live in a certain genre and kind of don't get discussed outside of that genre. So horror directors are it's kind of where that's going to live a lot of the time, because that's the genre that most people can live in and make a career in. Under discussed is just, you know, people that we think, you know, they might be more auteurist, but maybe they've only had a couple bites at the apple. Maybe they're people who have gotten a raw deal. Maybe they're people who are not people who are white men who don't get as many chances to make movies. And we want to discuss those people too. You know, it's about discussing people's filmographies that kind of fascinate us for one reason or another. The plan is to not dive into those people like Christopher Nolan or Quentin Tarantino or Steven Spielberg or Martin Scorsese, the big, huge David Fincher, the big, huge names that a lot of people talk about a lot, because there are plenty of places that do that and they do it really, really well.
They do. And I love all those filmmakers, right? Like I would watch any of their movies right now, but there's this huge breadth of work about all of them. And I don't know, like maybe it's because of who we are and what we've done. I mean, I'm kind of out of the corporate commercial video world, but I did that for a long time too. I never really had I was never one of those kids that's like, I'm going to go work in Hollywood someday. You know, I kind of as a college student gravitated more toward the theory side of things. So that's what I do now. I teach film theory and I also teach production and audio production and things like that. But for me, it was like, that sort of underappreciated filmmaker, like this idea of someone who is just not getting talked about regularly. Like, I think it's because it's really hard, like the people who do, all those kids who are like, I do want to go work in Hollywood and make movies on that sort of level. That doesn't happen for a lot of people. And even those who do, a lot of them, most people don't know who they are or don't care who they are. So I feel like it's an underdog story, right? It's dodgeball. It's a true underdog story. We're talking about these filmmakers who, deserve it. I think that are just worth talking about in the same way that all those other ones are.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really a show about finding the gray areas and talking about how things can be more than one thing at once, right? Great directors can make bad movies. Mediocre directors can make great movies, right?
Sure.
And there can be great things in bad movies and terrible things in great movies. Like these things exist at the same time and don't cancel each other out necessarily. I think too much of all discourse, but especially I think as, film criticism has become more and more, short form, because this is the way things are going. And that's not me criticizing the people who do that work, because there are people who are really good at talking insightfully about movies in a very short amount of time. But just like every other thing, when everyone has the tools to do it, there's a lot of talking that is just, let me throw, this thing is terrible or this thing is the best thing that's ever existed. And I want there to be a little bit more of a shade when we talk about this stuff. And I think this movie is a great movie to start out with for that exact conversation, Tron Legacy. So why don't we kick it off and start talking about Tron Legacy? I'm going to crack open our dossier, Nick. And we're not going to go through every point of it, but I want to, kind of give a little background on Joseph Kosinski and how he got to the point where he was picked to direct a $200 million budgeted movie with the first movie he ever directed.
Yeah, like a Disney franchise movie. That's not something that you just start your career out on. But I mean, you really can't say that he starts his career out here, right? We'll get into it, but I've been watching a lot of his commercial work because I'm fascinated by that stuff, and I've done a little bit of that too, and it's really cool. Again, as I said, I think I don't run a studio yet. Maybe someday, maybe someone will throw $1 billion at me, and that's what I'm going to do with it. But like, I could definitely see if I were a studio head, like, yeah, that's the guy for this job, and that is the aesthetic, that's the style, that's the kind of filmmaker that we need for this project. But it's a huge, huge project. Like, we'll have to get into. I just saw Tron for the first time, as we've been talking about, and that was one that bypassed me when I was a kid, and I didn't realize that movie actually made money. Like, that was a pretty popular film. I always thought it was like kind of a notorious bomb, and I don't know where I got that from. Probably the Leonard Maltin Guide, because I read an awful lot of that. I must have like read something negative about it in there. I was like, no, I don't ever need to see that movie. But I mean, it's a franchise that Disney owned that they were looking to reboot, and a lot was sort of riding on this, and it wasn't just going to be this movie, but it was going to be this sort of whole media property with video games and comics and animated series and stuff like that. So it's a pretty big job that he was handed kind of right at the start of his career in some sense. Huge job.
And this discussion about Tron Legacy is also very much a discussion about the Walt Disney, film slate and film shingle, and the way they changed from the time this movie was greenlit to the time the movie released. Something huge happens the year before this movie gets released, and it completely changes Disney's whole way of operating. But on Kosinski, who was a Midwestern boy born in Iowa, he went to Columbia for architecture and doesn't go to film school, is always kind of interested in movies. And he said in interviews that like he thinks a lot of the most interesting filmmakers out there got their start in something other than movies. And so that was sort of a big kind of impetus for him to sort of do this thing, and gave him a really keen design sense, which we'll obviously see when we talk about the movie itself. In 2005, right, he moves to Los Angeles. In 2005, he writes a film treatment, which would eventually become an unpublished graphic novel called Oblivion for Radical Comics, which will be his follow-up film, which we'll be talking about next time, right, to Tron Legacy. So that is already in the hopper before he ever even touches, the Tron franchise. And then in 2007, basically 2 giant commercials come out, video game commercials come out, directed by him, right? The Halo 3 Starry Night commercial, which is an extremely influential and popular commercial. And then the real one that I think really knocks him over the edge is the Gears of War Mad World commercial. Seminal video game commercials. They're still using the Mad World song in Gears of War trailers that they show in 2024. It is synonymous with that franchise as anything else. Big deal here is that David Fincher was supposed to make that commercial, and he recommended Joseph Kosinski to make that commercial because he couldn't do it. So it's from those two that he then gets onto Hollywood's radar.
Can we talk about that Gears of War commercial? Like, I don't actually remember the Halo one once, but I definitely, having not seen Tron, and obviously Legacy wasn't out yet, but I remember I was an Xbox 360 guy, and I had a little bit more time to play video games at the time, and I always liked kind of story-based games, just being a movie person, like anything that was somewhat cinematic, and that was the era, right, where you had these... Like, I think games are, not that they hadn't done this before, right? I was hooked on Resident Evil back in the day, and even though the dialogue was terrible and everything like that, I was like, well, this is kind of like a movie you can play. But in that era, they really sort of pushed in that direction, I think, really heavily. And I just remember I didn't know much about Gears of War at the time, and seeing this trailer, which was, I mean, it's kind of everything that you would want in that type of video game experience, right? Like, clearly this is a game where you're going to get to shoot the hell out of lots of aliens, but also like there's this emotional thing kind of going on there. And certainly the music, Mad World, is it's one of those songs that just kind of does that to you. It triggers kind of an emotional response. But I just remember it's this visually incredible trailer. It showcases the world of the game really interestingly, and this character design, these big, huge buff dudes with gigantic guns, and but also you get the sense that you also are going to have to feel for this guy, this big hunk of meat, Marcus Phoenix. Is it Marcus Phoenix? Yeah. Yeah, I haven't, that was the only one in the series I ever played, and I really liked it. I remember really enjoying that game, but I think what made me buy that game back in the day was because I saw this commercial, and I was like, okay, this is going to be some next level thing. Like, I'm kind of immersed in this story and in this world already, and that's a really tough thing to do in 30 seconds. I mean, if you look at it now, I mean, maybe the imagery feels a little bit dated. It's got a very 2007 sort of visual design. I mean, that was the grim and gritty era of games also, but I enjoyed that. I didn't mind that at all. And you can just sort of get a sense just from seeing that this is cinematic. Like, this is going to be a game where I'm going to have some of those same sort of reactions to it as I would to a movie. And as hard, I'm terrible at video games. I always have, and I've been playing this since I was a little kid. I don't play multiplayer. I don't really play competitively. I like the story-based games. It takes me a very long time to get through them, but that gives me a lot of time to get invested in the story of Marcus Phoenix, which I don't remember. There's something with his family. It's been a while since I've played it, but I definitely remember seeing this trailer and be like, okay, like, I need to get this game. This is something that I think I'm really going to enjoy, just as, a fan of sci-fi movies and action films and games that kind of capture that as well as the other stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about both those trailers, the Halo trailer is two kids basically laying on the ground, like staring up at the sky talking, and one of them is Master Chief John Spartan before he gets like indoctrinated into like the program. So they're kind of like talking about the future, and it's also kind of emotional and very cinematic. But the Mad World one is obviously the one that sets the kind of world on fire. And like you said, it's emotional. It also has like a story sense to it. You can tell it someone's putting it together who understands storytelling, right? So that gets him a bunch of what they call in the business, right, general meetings, right, with studios. So he gets general meetings with Warner Brothers and with Disney at least. I don't know where else he gets general meetings, but Warner's taps him basically around the same time that he's getting tapped to do Tron Legacy, to do a remake of Logan's Run, which is one of those remakes that has been in the hopper. For as long as I can remember reading about movies on the internet, Nick, Logan's Run has been a movie that they've been trying to remake. And, it's one of those things where it didn't happen with him either. It had the Children of Men screenwriter, Tim Sexton, writing it. And he got the job the same way, pretty much, we're going to talk about with Tron, how he kind of convinced them to go the way they wanted to, which he created like a presentation for them. Basically, it's like, this is my vision for this, which obviously something that is probably, he got very good at it from doing commercials. He brings it to his design, and he has a design sense, right? Which he can automatically send out from the pack, which he can design something visually that is striking. And he does this, he gets this job, and just like all these other remakes of the movie, it doesn't go forward. But This is already, and that's another big movie, right? This isn't Warner Bros. Going, you can do like our $20 million thing.
Yeah, direct to video sequel to some, moderately popular theatrical movie.
Here's our like $40 million thriller starring Mark Wahlberg, right? The step up to doing like the big, huge movie, right? Immediately these places are like, we want you to do our big, huge movie. While he's making Tron, Disney wants him to do a Black Hole remake. This is very much the era where Disney is like, we don't know how to get young men to watch any movie that we put out, basically. We know that young girls will watch our animated movies. We don't know what to do when it comes to getting, young men to watch our movies. So they're trying like everything under the sun. They're remaking movies. They're greenlighting like kind of crazy properties. This is like when you got National Treasures going on and you've got, this is right coming off the Pirates success, right? Pirates was like a big, huge success for them. And they're like, okay, how do we recreate this? Because this actually got young men to come watch the movies. They're just throwing things at the wall. And Tron, like you mentioned, it gets pegged with this idea of being a flop, but I think it's more because people think of it as a joke. My main memory of Tron for such a long time was that Treehouse of Horror episode where
Homer goes to the grid. Yeah.
And he's like, I'm 3D, sure. Or like.
It ends with an erotic cake shop.
Yes,
I love that
it absolutely does. That was my only knowledge of it. And it was like them making fun of Tron, right?
Yep.
And so in my mind, even at this point, I'm like, okay, it was one of those movies that has a big cult following, but didn't make a lot of money. And then when I was going through the numbers, its budget was $17 million, which is a huge budget for 1982. Let's be fair. But
yeah, it
makes $26 million at the box office, right? It was their highest grossing live action film for 5 years was the $26 million Tron, which was about $98 million adjusted in today's dollars.
Well, it's also a movie that, at the time, 1982, I mean, that's a little before our time in terms of like when we were active. I was alive in 1982, but
I wasn't, Nick. So let's talk
films.
About how middle-aged we all are, okay?
Early middle-aged. I wasn't very alive, but I was alive enough. But like, imagine what computer graphics in a movie in that era. I mean, I caught the very end of that. My dad worked for IBM, so I was always kind of a computer nerd as a kid, a little bit. I mean, I wish I had been more. I'd have a much more lucrative job right now. But the thought of a CGI movie, right? Like, by the time I grew up enough to know what that wasn't an exciting thing anymore. So my impression of Tron all those years is just like, well, this was a movie that kind of introduced this one technology that became kind of a much bigger thing later on. But the thought of a movie that has visuals that are enhanced by a computer in 1982, that must have been mind blowing. But by the time I was old enough to know what that movie was and care to see that movie, I was like, oh, I kind of know what that is. And there's better versions of that now, So I think maybe that's part of why I forgot about the Simpsons episode also. Not even really a direct parody of Tron, right?
It's not at all. But he did call it like dumb or something like that, like how dumb it was. And so that, in my mind, it's like, oh, Tron's dumb. Like that was just in my mind, right? Tron is dumb.
And you look at that movie now, I mean, I think the look is incredible, and I'm sure it was back then. But if you just see like a picture of that in a magazine, which I know people don't read anymore, but I know I had seen some magazine that I read back in the day, they were like stills from that movie, and they were a little strange looking, these characters. It almost looks like silent film characters grafted onto these, stupid looking suits in this kind of virtual universe. And I don't know. I mean, it seemed very dated, and like, by the time I was able to appreciate things for their sort of nostalgia value and their kitsch value and things like that, like I said, it definitely bypassed me. But yeah, it wouldn't be, if I was running the Disney studio at that time or any time, it wouldn't be the first property where I thought, oh yeah, we need to do another one of those. Like, this is the thing. This is what's going to bring those young men, those Gears of War fans back into the theaters. Let's do Tron again. Let's put those suits back on.
So there's actually a really good Corridor Crew video, which are these YouTubers, so they kind of break down visual effects about Tron and about how they did the effects. It was really fascinating, and the tedium of it, right, to do it. But the big part of it, though, is that it made $98 million adjusted. It made $70 million in merchandise sales over the years, Tron. So there's your reason right there why Disney is like, well, maybe we should bring this back. Also, home video, obviously which I'm sure we'll talk about this many times as we go through, especially when we talk about older filmmakers, when we go back to those kind of people. Your movie used to not just be how much money it made on the opening weekend, right? There was a whole other system of revenue that your movie could get in order to really figure out what your audience was.
This ran, I believe it ran the first day on the Disney Channel. I think I read that somewhere, where one of the first things the Disney Channel showed when that became a thing was this movie, probably later on in the evening. I think, back in the day, it was a lot of cartoons and stuff on the Disney Channel, but when they got into their adult Disney After Dark, I guess you could call it, this was one of the things they showed, this PG-rated movie, but it was live action. It was a little more adult. People die, kind of, sort of.
Kind of,
Tron.
sort of, yes.
Not really people.
I mean, really, they couldn't show it before 9 p.m. because Jeff Bridges is too hot, so they couldn't show it before 9 p.m.
Well, Disney After Dark, exactly. But yeah, you have that. You have the sort of like that burgeoning cable market. You also have home video. As you were mentioning, this is kind of a multimedia era where your movie gets a video. And obviously, Tron, very suitable for arcade games, and really sort of capitalized on the early 80s arcade boom and really captures it kind of nicely in those openings. We have to talk a little bit. We'll get to it later. There's some things in the Tron movie before they go into the grid, before they go into the computer world, that I think are so cool, and that I don't feel like Tron Legacy does much with. But certainly there's a sense of this is not just going to be a movie, as we were saying about something before, but this is going to be like a multimedia property. Like, there will be video games, there will be arcade games, merchandising, plenty of merchandising opportunities, right? I have to imagine, I didn't look this up, but like they had to sell some sort of disc shooter thing that you could like go around and I would have gotten one. Definitely, if I had seen this back in the day, I would have wanted
absolutely that. So, kind of comes out in 1982, is a moderate hit, right? And then as the cycle happens, a bunch of people who are kids, or little kids when they saw Tron, get older, and all of a sudden they have dollars to spend, right? So in 1999, actually, Pixar had interest in remaking Tron. Then in 2003, there's a Tron video game called Tron 2.0, which does pretty well. And that kind of sets off another wave of people being like, well, maybe we should make Tron. That is really where it gets going and really gets its foot in the door. Now, originally, the original director, I think it was his name, Steven Lisberger, is sort of like talking about it and sort of still in conversations, maybe be involved in some way more than just what he ended up being. But Disney ends up commissioning these two writers, Brian Klugman and Lee Sternthal, to write the script. The reports are that it really went very hardcore into like the internet today, and it was very Matrixy, right? We're coming off of not that many years after The Matrix. The Matrix sequels are about to come out. That script kind of is what gets some purchase, but much like all scripts in Hollywood, it doesn't survive for very long. 2007, like we mentioned, Kosinski is brought in for a meeting and is hired to direct the movie. And he immediately is like, I don't like this script. This script is not Tron. And so he asked Disney for a certain amount of money to go off and make this sort of short film to show them like, no, this is what I think it should be and what it should look like. And he brings it to them and they love it. And he's able to then kind of go forward making the movie that he wants to make from there. They bring on two other writers who sort of rewrite it to his sort of vibe that he's looking for. And I was listening to an interview today and he starts bringing in all of these people from outside the movie industry to start designing the world of Tron Legacy. He brings this guy, Dan Simon, who was basically making like these really interesting, like conceptual cyber vehicles. He sees like a website basically, and he calls him. He was like, I think he's German or something. Calls him and basically says like, we're interested in working on Tron. And the guy like got on an airplane and came to Hollywood like the next day. It was only a 67-day shoot, which is kind of insane for this size of a movie. All the grid stuff was shot totally in 3D, which I forgot. I saw this movie in 3D in IMAX. And all the 2D stuff, all the out of grid stuff was in 2D. And then when they go into the grid, it all becomes 3D, which was a very cool effect.
Yeah, I'm sorry I missed this in a theater, and I'm sorry I was not able to see it in 3D in IMAX. Like, this movie, because this is the time, right? I mean, this is just 1 year after Avatar. So like, this is Hollywood's period of everything needs to be 3D. And every time you go to the theater to see anything that's not like a chamber drama with 2 or 3 people in it, you are seeing it in 3D. You're putting the glasses on, you're depositing them in the box when you leave. And you know, I got tired of that really fast. Like, I thought Avatar did incredible stuff with 3D, just the way that movie looked, and that movie kind of was designed, kind of built from the ground up as a 3D movie. And then there was like that post-processing 3D stuff they were doing where they take a 3D movie and kind of sort of make it 3D, and it was like about as good as old Magic Eye books. Now that makes me sound early middle age. But like, this was that era where like even 3D wasn't a big deal. Like, everything was just sort of 3D. But I feel like certain movies really took advantage of that. And this one, just seeing it now in 2024, I got a decent sized TV, but nowhere near the experience this must have been to see it in that format. Like, I could definitely, and especially what you're saying, I didn't know that. Like, I thought the whole thing was, you know, maybe they post-processed the real world stuff, but the fact that it like kind of jumped to 3D when they went to the grid, that must have been awesome.
It was a really great theater going experience. I think I saw this opening weekend, the biggest screen I could find, and I think that I was almost immediately bored of the 3D thing, especially because I wear glasses, so I had to put the 3D glasses on top of my glasses, and it was always a pain in the ass. But movies like this, obviously Avatar, some of like the Pixar stuff, you know, they used 3D in interesting ways because they were intentionally doing it. It was the stuff like, I think one of the biggest ones was the Clash of the Titans remake was a post-processed 3D. It was horrible. It was blurry and awful. And they just started doing that with everything, and they drove it into the ground, right? And now like, they still put out some movies in 3D, mostly like,
it's very rare these days. Yeah, like, I thought it was going to last longer, but Hollywood's done that so many times, right? They had a cycle of those in the 50s. They had a cycle of those in the 80s. You know, they did Jaws 3D and Friday the 13th 3D, which looks real bad in 2D. I like that movie, but I think it does kind of date your movie in a certain way. Like, if it's, because I remember even some of the stuff coming out during this cycle, the post-Avatar cycle, you could tell watching them at home, because they had 3D televisions. That was kind of a trendy thing for a while that did not last long. But for a while, it was like, oh, okay, this was, you know, clearly this was a much cooler experience in a theater in 3D. And now it just kind of looks very like the Polar Express, I think, is a good example of that, where still an okay movie, but definitely designed. And I saw that in the theater in 3D. It was awesome. It doesn't quite hold up the way I would have liked it to. But I feel like even today, if there was a way to see Tron Legacy in 3D, it would still be a pretty awesome experience and would just kind of immerse you in a way that, like, when done right, like, I'm not anti anything, right? And I think that's another thing, we haven't really mentioned that, right? But you and I, we both love movies, and we want movies to succeed, and we want movies to be good, and, you know, we're probably going to have to trash stuff somewhere along the line here. Like, not all of these journeyman filmmakers. Sometimes, you know, everybody strikes out every once in a while, but, like, you know, if 3D when used well, I think that's awesome. CGI when used well. I love practical effects. I'm always going to be a practical effects guy because I grew up with that, but that's age bias or something. But a great a great CGI effect is still what it needs to be. You know, I think you can make that work. And so I guess whatever it is, it just depends on the filmmaker behind it and whether they're using that technology. Like, no technology necessarily is bad. Well, AI might be eventually. I don't know. I'm going to get probably heated about that as we go along in the show. But thus far, I haven't seen any other technology used in films where I'm like, oh, that's just a gimmick and that's terrible. I mean, it really depends on the person who's behind the camera and the creative vision behind it. And I think this is actually a perfect example of that, of, you know, this is a movie that should have been in 3D.
Anything done with intention and with artistry, I think, can deliver on what I want from a movie just as anything else. Another thing I would say too is, as we get into the movie, talking about the movie itself, is that I try my best when I'm talking about movies, and I don't always succeed. Sometimes I fail horribly at this, but I'd really try to meet the movie on its own terms and not try to review it or talk about it against a movie that doesn't exist, right? Against the movie I had in my head. I really think if they had brought back this person, it would have been better. Well, they didn't bring back that person, so why don't you talk about what's actually in the movie, you know?
Yeah.
So like,
Right.
I try my best. I'm not perfect at it, but it is really kind of my guiding principle when I talk about stuff.
Yeah, same here. Because it's like they didn't hire me to make this movie, so who am I to say, right? Like whatever Joseph Kosinski did, that was his thought, and whether it works or whether it doesn't, it's his movie.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a very important distinction to make when you're talking about this stuff, because I think too often, especially in like fan culture discussions, it's so much about, well, if I was doing it, it would have been like this. And I'm like, well, you're not doing it.
Are you saying modern fan culture is a little toxic?
And it drives me crazy. I'm like,
No.
just enjoy the space movie. All right. I don't care.
Just enjoy movies. Just enjoy the fact that you are seeing a movie. Like, movies are incredible. I've always thought that. I've always felt like, this is an incredible art form, and it's so easy to just get lost in the weeds of like wanting to do things different. And particularly if you're someone like us who's like, you've probably written scripts before, and I know you've made short films, and I've done that stuff too, but it's like, this medium is incredible, and we lose sight of, because there's so much of it. Like, movies aren't novel anymore, the same way I was saying with CGI in the original Tron. You don't look at a CGI movie and I'm like, wow, that's incredible, like that was done on a computer. But just the fact that movies exist, and I don't know, I think that's sort of where we're coming from here, and that's when we first were talking about doing the show. That was one of the things I really liked that we were discussing, was just the fact that we really do love movies, and yeah, we want to kind of meet them at their level, and we're not here to just talk about what we would have done, because if we could have done better, we would be doing better, right? We would be out there making them. And probably still failing miserably, because a lot of films do. I'm not saying that nothing is bad. Things are very bad sometimes. But yeah, like I do. And I think you can also find the good in movies that are mediocre. And, like, even if it's mostly bad, there might be something, some idea, some visual, I don't want to put all my cards on the table. I didn't 100% love Tron Legacy, but there are some things about it that I found memorable and that I'm going to think back on, and, I would see it again for sure. And it is hard to make a movie that connects with people on any level, right? Like, if something is dumb and boring, well, then it's probably irredeemable. But there are movies that are dumb in ways that are fascinating and fun and enjoyable, and you kind of just want to see them again. And I am a person who will love to defend those movies. I feel like I can't wait to see Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis in IMAX. I feel like that's a movie that I'm going to be telling people, this is brilliant. I know it looks really cheesy, and I know it's getting bad reviews, and some of the dialogue is pretty daft and crazy, but like, I don't know. I feel like those are the kinds of movies, like, I'm going to remember that movie much more than I'm going to remember something that's just kind of mediocre or was just kind of a cash grab kind of thing.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, let's actually talk about Tron Legacy, the film. Right from the beginning, we'll be able to talk about, I think, one of the albatrosses around this movie's neck, because it happens almost immediately. It opens with this voiceover from Bridges' character, Flynn. The most notable thing about that, though, and we can talk about this right away, is the Daft Punk score starts immediately, which, when you talk about things that are memorable about movies, this is, I think, one of my favorite movie scores of all time. And it was Kosinski's choice to go after Daft Punk to do the music for this movie. He didn't want a traditional film composer. He wanted something fresh and different. He said there was a lot of interest from, other electronic acts. And originally he was like, okay, well, we can pair you up with like some seasoned composers because it's your first movie. And they said they took a lot of meetings with a lot of like big time composers. I don't know who they were. After like the last meeting, the Daft Punk guys basically called them and said, we can do it ourselves. And then they did it themselves.
Well, see, I read, and I don't remember where I saw this, but Daft Punk kind of mentioned, maybe this was later, and maybe they kind of just said this after the film had came out and was successful and was kind of lauded for its score, but part of their aesthetic had to do with seeing Tron at a young age and being like, oh, that's really cool looking, and that sort of cyberpunk thing that film kind of was touching. I mean, it's a very sanitized Disney cyberpunk, but you could tell how an electronica group like that would see that and be like, yeah, we think synthesizers and computers are pretty cool too. So yeah, I mean, it's a perfect marriage of composer and subject matter and stuff like that. I think it's a really great score too, and I love what they did here, but I'm just kind of imagining now, like, what if they had gotten someone, Michael Giacchino or like, God forbid, John Williams or something. And it's like them and Daft Punk doing the score for this movie. Like that would have really set the world on fire.
Yeah, I mean, I can't, I have no perspective on the score because still listen to it now. What I love about it is that it is not just, here's a bunch of Daft Punk music that they put into Tron, right? It feels like a score only they could ever do. This like specialness to these people coming into this medium and sort of figuring it out. And it's kind of like Kosinski's own story, right? His first movie coming not from a movie background, Daft Punk coming in, their first and only film score, I think, right to this point. Again, not a lot of movies have anything iconic about them that lasts, 15 years later. And this movie has one of those things. So we kick off right with that voiceover. And then we're into like, okay, here's Jeff Bridges. We're behind his back to start out with, talking to a young kid, just talking to him. His head's moving a little bit weird when he's talking, but we don't know what's going on. Then we get a little silhouette of it, like a little side shot of his face, kind of lit very dramatically. And you're like, okay, this looks like young. This looks a little bit weird, but it looks okay.
It's better de-aging than they did years later for stuff like The Irishman. I was kind of surprised.
It is not better than The Irishman. Are you crazy, Nick?
There are moments. But yeah, like I didn't realize they really had the ability to do that this well back then. And it's not great. You're right. I mean, it's not perfect, but
he looks like an animated character.
Yeah, but he could look more like an animated character. I had just seen Tron the day before. Literally, I watched this. I wanted to see them close together. I was very confused by this opening, and it's meant to get people up to speed that hadn't seen Tron recently. But we're in 1989, but we know that this film is going to be set late. I don't know. It's the original films, I guess, takes place in 82, and we get this 1989 flashback, and that was handled a little clunkily, I thought. And it didn't engender a lot of sympathy from me right away. I was like, oh, what are we doing?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's supposed to denote that he's been doing it all those years, like even after. Because look, I think, and then the real moment is when he kind of stops and turns around in that doorway. It's like just full on flat lighting on the face.
Yeah.
I was like, no. I can't.
Yeah, I love Jeff Bridges. I want real Jeff Bridges.
Exactly. I know what Jeff Bridges looks like. You're going to show me real Jeff Bridges in 2 seconds after this.
Plus, this is the same year as True Grit, so we've seen Jeff Bridges at his, I hate to say, gritty best, but...
And so, I think that effect is kind of albatross around this movie's neck, I think, the entire running time of the movie. Here's my kind of take on it. I think if they had just saved it for inside the grid...
Well, it's thematically and narratively appropriate there, right?
Exactly.
Once we're in the grid, everyone's basically a computer. You're either a computer program or you're a user or you're an ISO. We'll get into that business later on. But
yeah.
But yeah, I think I would have bought it. And they could have done something. I mean, if you enhanced it whatever way, visual effects wise, but it's taking place in the grid, yeah, I think you'd believe almost anything.
Yeah, exactly. So if they just waited till that point, if they weren't trying to sell it as this is terrestrial Jeff Bridges, because it's not the only time they use it that way, right? They do those kind of flashbacks, which I think are well directed and well utilized later on. But because of this sort of, especially when they have the two of them talking to each other, I'm like, you just have two animated characters talking to one another and it doesn't work. And then once you put that Jeff Bridges in the same shot as real Jeff Bridges, then it starts to become even more difficult to handle. I mean, it's super impressive for this time, right? We are still I forgot, when was Ant-Man? 2015 was Ant-Man, 5 years later, I think, which has the de-aged Michael Douglas, which looks pretty much flawless. They get to that, and obviously in Captain Marvel a couple years later, they have Sam Jackson as a main character walking around, young, and he looks pretty much perfect. You can already see Disney being somewhat obsessed with this element of being we want to do this older character as younger, but we don't want to cast a different actor to play him as a younger person, right? Which could have been totally fine if they had just done that.
Well, it could have been if there wasn't the original movie, because I was thinking that too.
Yeah.
What do you do in that sense, right? If we were just meeting this character for the first time, then yeah, you get some younger actor who looks a little bit like Jeff Bridges. But because Tron exists, then you kind of can't really do that. Like, we need that Jeff Bridges, we need that particular guy from the, and as I said, it could be a lot worse. It gets the job done. Yeah, it's not the greatest thing to see right at the top of this movie, but you know, we do get like a couple of seconds. We see the grid. We get this. I actually liked that voiceover, the way he kind of explains what the grid is, because I don't think the first movie really does that very well. And you're just supposed to sort of envision it in the original. Oh, that's what the inside of a computer looks like, right? Like, that's what a video game looks like for the sprites, the characters in the video game. Whereas here, you know, the idea of it's a city, it has vehicles, like how would you move through this interconnected sort of universe? I mean, the script of this is probably the worst thing about it, I will say, but there's some ideas and there's some stuff like that I think really works. And because we do get those couple of seconds in the grid with that sort of warm, reassuring Jeff Bridges voice at the beginning, it's not a deal breaker for me.
I just think that scene with the kid is kind of useless.
I agree. Yeah.
You could have done the opening voiceover, added a little bit to it, him talking about going in and out of the grid until one day I got stuck and left my family behind or whatever. And then you just see, you know, Garrett Hedlund and you'd get it. You know, you don't need the little kid crying, watching his dad walk away with his grandparents.
Yeah.
Like, there's just some stuff in here.
He went out for cigarettes.
He went out for cigarettes or whatever.
It's one of those things.
It's just one of these things where, and it's funny because now I think in modern 2024, we've swung way too far in the other direction where people are just like, we don't need any of these scenes anymore.
Yeah.
We don't need any of these scenes where we try to connect people to the characters. Let's just get to the action or get to the fun stuff. This is one of those things where there's a lot wrong with modern cinema, but people need to understand there was always a lot wrong with big budget filmmaking. We're going to go farther back than 2010 when we go over some movies, you know, with other filmmakers, and you'll see them, you'll come up again and again. But this idea of like, okay, if there's a kid and he's sad, people will immediately emotionally connect. There's these like shortcut things that the screenwriters and big studios, especially with screenwriters, try to do. But yeah, we started with that, and then we're thrown into modern day, right? 2010 modern day in a corporate boardroom where NCOM has been taken over by Jeff Bridges' man. He just wanted technology to be free and everyone to be in love, and he was a good billionaire. These billionaires are bad. They want to sell their operating system for money. Which I love that that's like the nefarious thing they want to do that they can't stand is they want to sell this thing for money. But we do get a random one scene performance from Cillian Murphy.
Well, did you I didn't recognize him at first. I was like, oh, that guy kind of looks like Cillian Murphy. But I guess the idea for that was there was going to be a sequel that directly follows, because there is Tron Ares. There's a sequel planned for next year or the year after that it's going to kind of take this off in another direction. But he's the son of the villain from the first movie, or the real world villain for the first movie. Now he's sitting on the board of the company, which why would he be? It kind of doesn't make a lot of sense, but a lot of stuff in this movie doesn't make a lot of sense. But the idea there was like that scene was going to pay off in the scene, but like that is not resolved at all in the end here. Like we never go back to the boardroom. Like one of the complaints that I have about this, and it's probably not a complaint that anyone else has, is I'm kind of interested in NCOM and this whole corporate espionage thing. And the first movie does a lot of that. I will say, the original Tron, one of the things that surprised me about it, one of the things I kind of liked about it, was we do get a lot of that, like the human story taking place in the real world before we go into the grid. And I was surprised it never really went back to that. Like once it's resolved in the computer, it basically all just kind of resolves itself completely in the real world. But in that first film, just sort of the drama and what the plot is driven by the original Tron. It's like this evidence that one guy stole another guy's programs and stuff like that. Like, it's not the most compelling stuff in the world, and not really something to hang a huge budget movie on, like a tentpole kind of movie. This one dispenses with that really quickly. What I really like, though, and I just want to mention this here before I forget to say it, the original Tron does this thing that I thought was so cool, where the real world, before we go into the grid, before we even see it, it's shot in a way where there's like lots of right angles and like neon lights and flashing red lights, stuff like that. It almost has that sort of grid-like look about it, and it's very clearly done. You know, there's a moment where the Cindy Morgan character and Jeff Bridges are running through like a server room, and it's like these squares that they're kind of running between. It looks a little bit like a video game, and I thought that movie did such a good job, and it was so careful and meticulous. And Steven Lisberger, like, he hasn't really made a lot of movies, movies. Tron is kind of his be all and end all almost. He made a couple of other things, but I thought that was such a cool idea. And then when we go into the grid and the way that those two worlds sort of mirror each other was very cool. And Tron Legacy could do that so easily, and we've seen already with the commercial stuff, Joseph Kosinski, like the architecture guy, right? Like you would think he would do these real world scenes kind of in a similar way, and could do it so much cooler than the original movie, just with the budget and with the technology and everything. And we don't really get that. It feels like this movie wants to get us into the grid as fast as possible, and we're not supposed to. Maybe I'm just too invested in the business dealings of NCOM, but in that first movie I was.
Yeah, I think maybe you are.
I want to see a Tron movie where it's just the boardroom of NCOM, like it's a Succession type thing. That's what I want. That's not at all what I want.
If this movie came out in 2024, that would 100% be the Disney Plus series.
Oh, yeah, that would be the series. And then you'd want to get into the grid so badly. You'd be on episode 6, like, come on, just digitize yourself.
Exactly. I mean, we're in the grid sub 20 minutes into this movie.
And this movie's so much longer than the other. It's like 40 minutes longer than the original Tron, and we spend way less time. There's a cool little chase series, nice, so Sam, years later, Kevin Flynn's son, Sam Flynn, breaks into NCOM, and, just to play a prank on them, he's just been like...
He's a little scamp.
Messing with them. Yeah, just like harassing this multi-billion-dollar company, his dad's company. Which is kind of a fun idea that doesn't really...
It is. It's very... This whole opening sequence, though, I will say, is very Nolan, Bruce Wayne coded.
I'll give you that, yeah. Well, it looks like a car commercial, which Joseph Kosinski made those. Yes,
it absolutely does. But it also, just the jumping off the building.
Yeah.
And the kind of my name's on the door, or that whole I'm untouchable, I'm just a little scampy billionaire kid or whatever. Again, I don't want to impose logic on a movie that doesn't really need it, at this point. But you'd still be in trouble. You can't break into a company and steal their intellectual property just because you're a shareholder in the company. That's not really how it works.
There's a very sympathetic security guard that catches him and just oh, that's who you are. Kids being kids.
And I love that he knows, oh yeah, some kid owns all the stock or whatever. I'm like, this guy would not know who the majority stockholder in NCOM is.
Well, that's the show that I want to see. It's about the NCOM stock. And
if Cillian Murphy is the star of it, sign me up for it. But yeah, there was going to be a sequel. Tron Ascension, I think, was supposed to be the sequel. And that was going to be about the computer world coming into the real world, basically. Kosinski has said the first act was going to be set in the real world. Second act was going to be set in on the grid. And the third act was going to be the grid coming into the real world, basically. Which is obviously a big aspect of this movie, and another thing on the scripting level, which I kind of I think is a problem with the movie, but because I think the stakes are really weird. But I will say
they're higher than the first movie, though. Like this plot doesn't make sense, but at least there's a sense of this is going to affect more than just one person.
Though I will say this, and this is one of the things I want to talk about, is that in that scene we do get, in sort of the Morgan Freeman, Lucius Fox role, Bruce Boxleitner is back.
Yes, wasn't originally supposed to be, and I love that they brought him back.
Yeah, as Alan, I don't remember his last name. Alan something, right?
Alan Tron.
No, he has an actual last name.
Yeah, I think he does, but he's Alan Tron.
And he's sort of, the sort of surrogate father figure to Garrett Hedlund's character, and I think that scene that they have in Hedlund's, I don't know the functionality of his apartment that he lives in, which is basically
it's a beautiful, it's like a multi-million-dollar shipping container apartment that overlooks a bridge. It reminds me so much of one of my favorite things in Top Gun Maverick, which we'll talk about a few weeks down the road. Pete Mitchell Maverick's his lair in that movie, which is it's like GQ on steroids. I can't wait to talk about that movie, but feels like a prototypical version of that, like the ultimate man cave apartment. And I don't know, I don't know about you, but I'm that kind of dude. I see the stuff in there, I see that kind of setup, I'm like, yeah, I would live there. That's pretty cool.
Oh, totally. And I think that, but I think again, we're starting to see the Kosinski design ethos come into play already here.
High-end luxury, car commercials, as I mentioned, magazine ads, like he's that world. And I like that stuff, I enjoy a high-end car commercial. I will never own a brand new Mercedes-Benz or something like that, but I do love, the Super Bowl era, or, the playoff commercials around, where the dad just brings home a brand new, like, $100,000 car and puts a bow on it for the family. Like, that is the world of Joseph Kosinski.
There's a great Saturday Night Live sketch that parodies that, where I don't know if you've ever seen it, but he brings it home, and I think it's Cecily Strong is like the mom in it or whatever, and I think it's Beck Bennett, I think, is like the guy, and she's like, what the hell are you doing? She's like, we can't afford this, and then this whole thing. It's really funny. It's a really funny thing, but but again. He's bringing something to this movie, right? This set would not be in this movie if Joseph Kosinski did not direct this movie, right?
No, not at all.
And the people in the production have said that he was one of the most involved directors they've ever experienced in the previs design aspects of this kind of stuff. This gives a good opportunity to talk about a couple of the performances. I think in this scene, Bruce Boxleitner, I think he's fantastic in this scene.
Yeah, he's a great actor.
This bit was featured in the trailer. You got a page from your dad, throws him the keys. And I also think it is Garrett Hedlund's best scene in the whole movie. Because I will say this, another albatross around this movie's neck is Garrett Hedlund as the center of the movie.
I agree with that, but I think it's a very underwritten character. I don't think he was given much to work with there. I've seen Garrett Hedlund in other things. I think he's very good. And he has another thing that we need to talk about with Joseph Kosinski is just again, I don't want to keep talking about him as like an advertising kind of director, but you look at his commercials and many commercials are like this, right? But it's very, very sort of superhumanly beautiful people in these very slick, technologically advanced sort of environments, very wealthy luxe sort of, high-end hotel suites that I can never afford to stay in. It's that kind of world, right? And I think Garrett Hedlund has the perfect look for that. Olivia Wilde, who's in this movie, we'll get to her soon. She has the perfect look for that. Jeff Bridges, not so much, but you got to have your Jeff Bridges. But I do think, particularly Garrett Hedlund and Olivia Wilde, they fit Joseph Kosinski's aesthetic perfectly. But they're both, and in Olivia Wilde's case, it doesn't need to be a particularly well-written character. She's, not human. We'll get to that. But Garrett Hedlund is supposed to be and kind of doesn't come off that way. But this is a good scene. I mean, it's I remember seeing that in the trailer and not knowing anything about Tron and not caring about this movie. I was like, that's kind of compelling. I kind of want to see this. I should have seen this, as I said, should have seen it in the theater. It checked all the boxes for me and I just kind of ignored it. And I don't know why.
And he has an emotional truth to play in this scene, right? Which is why I think it works so well. And he's also playing off another actor who is, I think, raising the level of the scene that he's in. I think that where he fails is once the sort of movie gets into, now you've got to be genre, pithy action star guy. None of the jokes that he speaks elicit even a smile. It's a lot of I can't even believe that just happened type of commenting humor. It's really tough to do that well. And so when you have actors who can do it well, obviously you've got your Robert Downey Jr.,
Ryan Reynolds,
and people kind of pass off as, well, it's kind of their thing. And it's kind of it might be a little bit lazy or it's easy for them. It is incredibly hard. Just like it's incredibly hard to act off stuff that isn't in front of you. There's a certain skill set that needs to be at play in movies like this. And he just is not the right person for a movie like this. At this time, I just want to say, this time, though, everybody wanted him in movies like this. He was a guy at this point. He was every big franchise part, his name was somewhere on a list. We need a new Batman. It's going to be Garrett Hedlund. We need a new whatever. It's going to be Garrett Hedlund.
Him and Sam Worthington. How did that all work out?
Garrett Hedlund was in Troy. The first movie he ever did was Troy. He was Patroclus in Troy. His whole point of the movie is to be pretty. There's nothing else in that character to be pretty. But then he's Don Billingsley in Friday Night Lights, which Friday Night Lights, we might talk about Peter Berg at some point on this podcast. Friday Night Lights is a great movie, an underrated movie. It's obviously, it gets paled in comparison to the TV show that was created, but it's a great movie, and he's very good in it. He's then in Four Brothers, right? Which
I remembered it. Yeah, I think the first time I saw him was in Four Brothers, which is, we mentioned $40 million Mark Wahlberg movies. That's one of those, but actually directed by like an auteur director. Like, I don't even know if we can talk about John Singleton. Maybe his later career we could talk about on this show, but like he was a name. He's a household name of a filmmaker.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I don't remember Garrett Hedlund doing a heck of a lot in that movie.
No, I don't remember. I barely remember that movie at all. And then he's in Aragon, which is one of those like failed YA kind of adaptations.
Yeah.
He's in Georgia Rule. And then he's kind of in this, it's also honestly occupying this space as well with Four Brothers, Friday Night Lights, Georgia Rule, Country Strong, these movies that don't really exist anymore, right? Which are these mid-level, mid-budgeted sort of studio dramas. But all this time, he's getting, what franchise is he going to take? Tron is the thing he gets.
Probably not the right project, is what you're saying.
No, probably not the right project. And then the rest of his career is interesting. He is fucking electrically good in Inside Llewyn Davis. As one of has become one of my favorite Coen Brothers movies, and I love all their movies. It's become one of my favorite movies, probably period at this point.
Yeah, I'm there with you.
Playing a role that would 100% be Austin Butler in 2024.
Yeah.
But that's kind of energy I think people were expecting from Garrett Hedlund. That just never materialized. And I think he's mediocre to bad in this movie.
It's very tough, though. Like, what I was thinking, because I agree, mediocre to bad is almost a nicer way to describe it than I would describe it. But he has to be, like, he is that superhero. He's that action hero guy with the quips and the one-liners and all that. But he's also an audience surrogate into this, like, very fantastical sort of world. And because it is all artificial, I mean, I think it's a tough needle to, there's a lot of fine lines that I think this movie has to walk, and some of them I think it's very good at, and some of them not so much. But yeah, I don't envy him. I mean, I'm sure the paycheck was good, and I'm sure this was going to be a springboard to lots more roles like this, but I don't know. I think it's a tough role to play. And it's underwritten also. He's underserved by the script. I really, again, I don't want to talk about what I would have done. I think I would have had them take another couple of passes at the script of this movie.
Absolutely, I agree with that. But I will say this. The movie already, when you're watching it, it is astounding. It's a first-time filmmaker because it looks gorgeous already. Like, what I really like about his style, and I'm excited to see if this continues. I don't really remember forward. He does these like almost like Jonathan Demme-esque close-up shots, like centered close-up shots on people's faces all the time, which I think look great. And have a really nice style to them. And then we go to the arcade, which obviously also is designed to the teeth, and it looks great.
Oh, I love that. I wanted to spend a lot more time there. I mean, probably because I had just seen the original movie. It's like, oh, we're back at Flynn's Arcade. And the dinginess of it, like, why does that still exist in this world? No idea, but it's a very cool set, and yeah, it's designed beautifully. The old arcade games with the plastic over them, and the sign, that marquee still out front. Like, it's so many things aesthetically in this movie are just like exactly what they need to be. I love his office, his sort of like secret lair in there. Yeah, it's a very fun scene. I mean, completely given away in the trailer. That was another thing in the trailer. I was like, oh, that's really cool. But yeah, nice little throwback to the original movie. Because like that is something that this has to do. Like, we're talking about this movie in such a way as like it's a 2010 movie, and it's part of this particular movement, during that period of what big budget tentpole movies were supposed to be. But also it has to connect to that original, and it has to, like, there are some fans, like, I know Tron wasn't the biggest thing in the world, but there were some people who saw this because it was a Tron movie, who were not 12 years old, who saw that original movie and was like, I want to see this world again. And it does a pretty good job of that in a lot of ways. I mean, even though we'll talk about the grid and what it looks like here, it doesn't look anything like the first movie, but it does feel like an evolution in some sense of what that aesthetically sort of was. So I liked that about it a lot. And yeah, I love this set. Like, I don't know, I wish this was a bigger movie and they had built that at Disney World, and you could just go, like, wouldn't it be cool to just go to Flynn's Arcade?
It's funny you say that, because I was at Disneyland in 2010 and they did it.
Really?
At night at the California Adventure Park.
Oh, wow.
They turned like the Main Street USA into like Tron World. They had a God, what are the things? The big ships, the D-Resers or whatever they're called. I don't remember what they're called.
M-shaped
ships. They had like two of those, like basically like sort of like as like almost arches over the street. And at the end of the street, they had turned one of the things, the shops, into Flynn's Arcade. And you could go in, they had like tokens.
That would have been so lost on me back then, but now I'm like, that would have been so cool.
And everything was kind of like neon colored. And you could go in the arcade and play the games and stuff like that. It was really cool. It was a really, really interesting thing. They opened up a ride. Now they have a Tron Light Cycle ride at Disney World now.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I think all this stuff looks really nice. And this stuff, I think Headland is good at this like kind of silent, emotive film acting, right? Like I buy him in these scenes, right? His sort of like discovery, like his like confusion turning to interest, all that stuff. And I mean, right here, we're basically from this into the grid, right? We're into the grid.
The digitizing looks a lot better in this movie.
It does, but I will say, I wish they had gone for something a little bit more, because like that scene where Bridget does get digitized in the first movie, where he turns like a wireframe and they kind of de-res him bit by bit.
It's a still, yeah.
It's a still, but it's still like the sort of scope and ambition of that shot in 1982 or whatever is 1984 or whatever is 1982 is crazy at that point.
Yeah.
It's a very cool effect in this one, and then we're in it, and immediately, here's what I'll say. The design of this whole world is 145,000% my shit.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yep, I agreed 100%.
And one of the things they talk about in like interviews, the research I did was he talked about light, almost like complete darkness with just these like lines of light. White light, blue light, orange light, red light, all this kind of stuff. They built a lot of big sets for this and a lot of practical stuff. Obviously, there's a lot of CG because there has to be.
And it's totally acceptable. Like, if any movie's going to use a lot of CG, you want your Tron movie too. But yeah, I was impressed. I mean, that was another thing that kind of carried through this was how many practical sets they were and how good they looked and how perfectly they meshed with everything else. Because, you wouldn't want to have something that was at all organic looking. Like they were basically building sets that were supposed to look like computer graphics. Reminds me of, I don't know if you're a John Carpenter, I did a whole podcast on John Carpenter, Escape from New York. There's a sequence in that where they didn't have the computer graphics to do wireframes at the time, so they made models and taped like fluorescent tape on the edges of the models so it looked like a wireframe, and they just moved a camera through it, and it looks awesome. I love Escape from New York. And like I feel like this movie is like the 2010 version of that, where they're like building sets that are supposed to look like they are created in a computer, and now every audience member knows sort of what a CGI set looks like. So again, definitely some very, very interesting things visually here throughout. And one of the things I love about the original Tron, and I'm talking about it like I grew up with it, I definitely didn't. Those movies move, right? Like that one and this one, like it becomes this sort of chase movie, road movie kind of thing. Like I don't think my understanding of the original Tron, my, incorrect understanding of it was, there's the games, there's the light cycle, there's the discs thing. And I thought everything in between that was just going to be like people talking in a room that's like computer generated. And it's not that, it is this kind of, it's almost like a spy movie or like an on the road kind of, I don't want to call it like a North by Northwest kind of thing, but it almost has that sort of that forward momentum about it where you're sort of moving through the world. And very quickly, this movie does that too. Like the original Tron, it's a gladiator movie, and then it turns into a chase movie. And this one is kind of the same thing where, there's the arena and then there's the progression toward the portal and all that. So we get to see like all of these places, and they're like even in the first film, the way that they're interconnected, I thought was very cool. The way you can kind of get from one area to another and how that actually is interesting visually and interesting as part of the story as well. I didn't expect that out of the original. And I thought this one took that and, to the next level, which was a very cool thing about it.
Yeah, and I think you can tell, right, when actors are interacting with real things versus when they're not. Like even the best CG in the world, if the director isn't giving them something to interact with that is physical and real, it always affects performance. Only a very special breed of actor.
Yeah.
That's not the like truth for, right?
Petting the CGI dragon kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Kosinski talked about too in this, they wanted to do as much as they could practically, but obviously they couldn't do it all. And he said it was his job when they couldn't do it practically to give the actor everything he could to place him in a place where he could interact with what was going on, whether it was showing him previs, whether it was going over all the steps, whatever it might be. And I think you can feel that in the thing. They did the suits practically, which is crazy, right? The suits are real. And apparently they were a giant pain in the ass. It only lasted like 6 minutes at a time.
I saw that, right? Like LEDs that would like blink out after 12 minutes, 6 minutes or 12 minutes or something like that. They had to shut them off between takes. I mean, Yeah, like you didn't have to do that. I think that's another thing that's kind of defining of this movie is you could have very easily in 2010 made a Tron movie that's like, okay, we know what CGI is now. We can just kind of do this stuff. We can do it in like the easiest way possible. We can make it look cool. We'll do it in 3D. But there is this sense that they were kind of painstaking about a lot of things. Like, how is everything going to look? How are, as you said, how are the actors going to interact in this world in a way that makes it feel like, I feel like this is a weirdly tactile movie and it's not supposed to be, right? Like this world is not real. It's binary. It's zeros and ones. And yet there is like, there's a little too much like hand-to-hand fighting in this movie. Like there's so many cool ways that you could fight in a computer. And most of this kind of boils down to, you know, good looking, well choreographed martial arts sequences, you know, on the level of like any Marvel superhero movie from the time or something like that. But you know, the punches actually feel like they're connecting, right? Like there is a sort of tangible, tactile feel to the sets and to the interactions. And, you know, when someone gets hit by something, I love just another thing that we might not get to later, so let me mention it. This is a PG-rated Disney movie, but there's some pretty gnarly kills in this movie because all of the opponents are computer generated. So like a hole gets blown through a character's head, and like you see the pixels kind of explode out the back, and like, you know, if that was CGI blood, it would be really gruesome. You know, there's like an arm that gets severed at one point, and like you could kind of feel it, and that's another, like they don't have to do that, right? It's not what's the Adam Sandler movie? Is it called Pixels?
Yeah, Pixels.
Where he's like fighting video game characters. Like it could have just been that, and it totally isn't that, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think I think the fact that one of the things that he talked about was the reason they wanted the lights too is because he wanted the light to not only be something visually interesting to look at, but he wanted the light to be able to play off and reflect on the other actors and characters. So if you're playing, and he said, you know, that scene where we haven't gotten there, but when Olivia Wilde and him are kind of sneaking through that corridor to get out of like, you know, the Flynn's house, he's like, it was all lit just with their suits. Basically, that's all it was. You can't do stuff like that if you're not planning things out. And I think that's a big part of where I think a lot of modern sort of usage of it, I don't even put it on like the craftspeople or the directors necessarily, but the timeframes which you're making these movies, you don't have time to be intentional about what you're doing. You're just going like,
sure,
we'll put you in a green room and we'll put the stuff in around you later. And so they have to make movies like that because that's the speed they're making them. This obviously there's a big intentionality to every setup and shot and scene that's happening here. Like you said, we start with that first disc battle scene, which what I like about that scene is that it starts out and Sam is not very good at what he's doing, right? He's kind of bad at it. He's kind of fumbling around, and he progressively gets better. And I think that fight is sort of like sloppy at first and then gets a little tighter to the point where when he's facing Rensler, right? Rensler runs on the roof. When the thing flips, I was like, this is cool.
Well, what a cool evolution, as I was saying, too. I mean, the game in the original movie is more of a 2D sort of thing because that's what video games were in 1982. And now, as we said before, it's the Xbox 360 era where everything is so, like, when we first go into the grid and we first see the game, it's on multiple levels, like, structurally, physically, so they're kind of going down and up and like circling each other in this like very three-dimensional sort of world. And it's a very cool, like it still feels like Tron, but it does like the idea. I really think they did a great job of this thing that I think we've mentioned already, where it's like this grid, this computer world was evolving all these years alongside our world and kind of went in this direction. You know, it's like it's the 4.0 or 5.0 version of what we saw in the original film, and everything in this sort of has that aesthetic about it, right? Like this is, you know, it's like we took it, if it was 3-dimensional before, it's 4-dimensional, and it's a terrible way to say it, but you know what I mean? It's like it's like exponentially better, but the same thing.
Thinking about it, like I do like the concept of, you know, the system was left alone for 20 something years. And this guy whose whole goal, right, is to make the system perfect.
He's a digital fascist.
Yeah. Keep progressing the system, right? Making it, in his eyes, better.
By cleansing all the imperfections.
Exactly. The ISOs, which we'll get to. You figure out that Sam is not a program, right? That he is a person.
User,
right? A user. Is brought to basically Clue's throne room. And this is where we see CG Bridges again. And at this point, it doesn't really bother me, right? Because it's supposed to be like a computer version of Bridges. So I'm like, okay, I get it. He's kind of a dick. And what I love about though about movies like this, and I'm not saying this derisively at all, I'm saying this honestly, is he could just throw Sam like into one of those giant unending voids pits that are surrounding his tower. But no, in order to kill him, he's got to play a game with him, right? He's got to put him through the light cycle trial. And I think that scene is probably the high point of action scene in the movie, is the light cycle scene. I just think those things look universally and just eternally cool. And I love that they're basically playing Snake. Like that's basically what they're playing is Snake. I really like that scene quite a bit. And this is our first sort of inkling of Olivia Wilde's character in the scene as well.
I like it a lot as well. And as I was saying, that fight sequence in the grid, you know, the when he first gets there, I will say one of the things that surprised me about this movie is like the pacing of this is very, very, very good. And I'm going to give Joseph Kosinski credit for that. Like this movie moves, like there's always something cool to look at. The story progresses in a way where like you're never bored. There's never a moment where I'm like, okay, get on with it. I like the quest narrative that kind of develops. I love, that's just a thing that I'm always a fan of, where, you know, we get this idea of this is where these characters need to go. And like the story of the movie is what happens along the way to this end goal that we like can kind of imagine or envision or see. You know, in this movie, we kind of get a sense of where the portal is and how hard it's going to be. It's the Lord of the Rings thing, right? Like we know where they're going and what they need to do there. I like that. Like you can develop a great story with that because what happens along the way, the character interactions and the complications that happen between here and there, but you know, you're getting there. We're getting to the fireworks factory, another Simpsons reference. Right. Eventually. I do think the pacing is great, but there's not much action in this movie. Like there's these couple of scenes early on. There's a fight sequence in Michael Sheen's character's place, which we'll talk about.
I cannot wait to talk about that scene. I cannot wait to talk about that character. That's the thing I'm most excited to talk about.
All right. Well, we'll definitely get to that. I will just finish this point by saying, for a 2 hour and 10-minute 3D blockbuster from 2010, I was very surprised that there weren't more sort of sustained action sequences, because the first movie has those. And this one, it's very limited. And I was like, you know, what the audience that sort of was around at that time, watching Avatar, watching the original Iron Man, those movies have that. And this one doesn't really. Like it's pretty limited in not the scope of its action scenes, but just the duration and I don't know. I was surprised by how little action there was in what I thought was going to be like a, you know, balls to the wall action movie all the way through.
I completely agree with that. And I will say, like, I think again, just to praise the digital effects and also the shot composition and filmmaking in this scene. I think the effect where they, you know, which is obviously carried over from the first movie, this idea of like these kind of like Donatello bow staffs that turn into vehicles. The effect is great in this movie when the transformation happens. Really, really stellar. You know, if that was in a movie, again, I would say for most of this movie, if this movie was made today, you would be like, damn, that is a fantastic looking movie. But I will say, like, what I really like about how he does shoot and stage his action scenes is that we're not dealing with a cut a second, right? This is not a phonetically cut scene. There is long shots to establish geography. You know, there is a mix of close-ups, mediums, and wides that help you understand the situation and the stakes and how the scene is developing and evolving. Yeah. And like that stuff is difficult
and makes the settings feel real. As I was saying, like there is this sort of tactile sense through this whole movie that like they are fighting, even though it's a virtual environment that they're fighting in literally and in the world of the film, it does have that sense that you know, you kind of know where the boundaries of this world are. And you mentioned the void that he could have kicked Garrett Hedlund's character into. Like, yeah, there's like a dogfight scene at the end of this. It's kind of the final action scene in this movie, and it does feel almost like a World War II dogfight over water. Like there's digital water here. Like Tron at one point like plunges down into the depths of a digital sea of nothingness, and I like that kind of stuff. You know, it's like there's a sky, there's oceans, and there's a stormy sky inside this computer world for some reason. Yeah, and it looks really cool.
It does. It looks very cool.
No practical purpose whatsoever, but I love the look of it.
But I do think like that does feed into, I think, which is something that I do think the movie as an idea has, that I think actually has aged pretty well, considering sort of like you mentioned AI earlier. I think there are a lot of parallels in this movie to sort of like tech bro AI people, in the fact that like Clue is this like sort of like knockoff of this smart person who only idea of what art is, what good stuff is stuff that he's sort of seen before that he's trying to recreate in some way, right? Because he has like the memories or the mind of a lot of the same like perspectives as Flynn does, and they're all sort of like cheap impersonations. And if they don't go a certain way, they need to be kind of taken off and reset. And I feel like it's a lot about like corporate art and like AI in now times, and it had no idea that it was doing that. Right.
Yeah.
And
well, the original movie's really prescient in that way too. Like, as someone kind of mentions artificial intelligence, what happens when computers are smarter than us in 1982. And yeah, and like, I'm glad they didn't completely go in that direction for this movie. It sounds like that's what they're going to be doing in the next Ares, the one that we talked about that's coming out. But yeah, there is, I don't know, like some of that idea, some of the aesthetics or stuff, like it reminds me of, like I said, those grim and gritty video games of the time too, you know, the stormy sky and the digital sea that's just sort of a void and things like that, kind of really have that feel, that vibe about them.
Yeah. So basically Sam's going to lose, right? And this sort of light monster truck, I don't know how to really explain what it is, comes bashing through the arena wall, and you know, he gets picked up by this person who kind of, come with me if you want to, lives him, and they escape. Another cool scene, like he's very good at developing action sequences and changing up status quo of what's going on in the scene, I think pretty well. And this happens and they escape, and this is really our first face reveal of Olivia Wilde. I will say again, Olivia Wilde is an actress who I have liked in quite a few things. I think she's very good on House, you know, for her seasons on House. She's been in other things that I have enjoyed. Once again, when she's able to play, when she is given a human emotion that you can recognize as a human emotion to play, I think she does pretty well. But I think the like, I'm a hot lady who is kind of a child thing that they're doing, I think doesn't work really at all. They're trying to do sort of like this, like, you know, fish out of water thing with her, trying like, I'm not a human, but I'm trying to be a human. And so I'm kind of like a kid, you know, and they've done this in other movies and it's worked. They've done other movies and it hasn't worked. I don't think this works very much at all.
Well, it works in one scene. Maybe we'll get to it. I don't know if we're going to go quite that far into this. There's a really, I want to call it a lovely scene later in the movie between her and Garrett Hedlund, and Jeff Bridges' character is kind of just looking at them. It's his son, and this, we'll talk about kind of what she is. I mean, we
can talk about it now. Let's just talk about it.
Okay, so she's an ISO. I still don't 100% understand what an ISO is, but it's like it's a mythical being that has somehow just evolved, or not evolved, but like appeared out of nowhere inside the grid that is digital, but also connected to something kind of that is not digital and also not human.
It's biodigital jazz, man. That's
biodigital jazz. They're biodigital jazz. Yeah, they're the embodiment of that.
They are programs that came into being without Flynn having coded them. Basically, they're like spontaneous life in this digital world, basically, is what they are.
Right. And there is a thought that maybe they can have some effect on the real world somehow. Like
I mean, Nick, you're underselling what Jeff Bridges brings across, which is that these people are the key to saving humanity because they will cure all diseases and solve all problems in the world. That is basically what Jeff Bridges puts out about these ISOs.
I was kind of trying to forget most of that stuff.
Yeah. You said this movie is well paced, and I agree with you for the first 40 minutes of the movie. This next like 20 minutes when they're in Jeff Bridges' like weird white lighthouse or whatever.
Well, it's the hotel set from 2001.
Yeah, are slog city to me. When it's just like, I'm a son trying to find his dad, and I got thrown into this crazy world. I just want to find my dad.
Right. And he finds him, but it's Clue, which is kind of fun. Like, I think everyone knows right off the bat that is not his actual dad there. But then we do I disagree with you because I love Jeff Bridges so much in this movie. I love him so much in the original. I love him in general. One of the notes I made on the original Tron is like Flynn is such a fun character, and he's this just like quippy, like quick-witted, sarcastic, really just, there that moment I was talking about where him and Cindy Morgan are running through the server room and he like hides on it, like it's this like high stakes sort of chase sequence, and he just like plays a joke on her in the middle of it, and I was like, yeah, that's the Jeff Bridges that I like. And I was hoping in this movie he wasn't too much of like a gritty, sort of grizzled, old, cynical character.
Oh, no, he's not at all.
Yeah, he's a lot of fun in this. So, like, every time he is on screen as Flynn, God Flynn, he's literally the god in this world. And this whole thing is a huge religious parable, right? It's about the son of God. And I read somewhere online, someone kind of outlined how close, I'm not an organized religion guy, but you can recognize the story even if you don't go to church every week. But I really, really like him in this scene. I like him in this whole movie, and just him being on screen, just seeing his real face and him kind of being Jeff Bridges. And even when he talks about ridiculous shit like biodigital jazz or whatever, I'm 100% on board for it. Like I feel like this movie is always better when he's in it.
Oh, and I want to clarify. I don't disagree with you. I think Jeff Bridges is, this movie would not work if Jeff Bridges was not who Jeff Bridges is in this movie. And I think when he's talking about that monologue or whatever, I think it's totally enjoyable in like a crazy, weird way. What I'm more talking about is when they're like, okay, guys, let's just stop for a little while and let me tell you all the lore about this world and its rules. And it literally goes like, okay, stop the movie. We got to spend about 20 minutes telling you about what's going on and set up the stakes, because now we've pretty much ended all the sort of emotional stakes we already knew about, right? Which is that Sam wants to find his dad. Sam found his dad. Okay. So now what is the next thing to uncover? Okay. The simple answer is we got to get back out of the portal before it closes, right? That's kind of the stakes.
Your ticking clock.
Yeah, that's one set of stakes. I would have been fine if that was just the stakes of the movie. But then he's like, okay, no. Clue wants to go in. This is where I really think, for me, the thrust of the movie falls apart, even though I think there are really good scenes that come after this. He's like, Clue's been trying to get to the real world for a really long time, and I'm the only one stopping him. And we can't let it happen. I can't even move from this weird heaven house that I have because I'm afraid I'll get the disc that's on my back. For me, I'm like, okay, but what exactly happens if Clue gets into the real world? They never really set up the stakes of that. It's just one guy who looks like a CG Jeff Bridges who gets into the real world. I don't understand. What? Because they don't, like, he's not gonna have super. Kosinski's talked about this. He's like, they wouldn't have superpowers or anything if they get into the real world. So I'm like, okay, then what is like okay, you don't want to get there. I get that, because he's not a nice guy.
It would be a superpowered artificial intelligence. It would be Skynet, or it would be OpenAI.
But no,
like
he can't control computers or whatever once he's in the. There's no. This is what I'm saying. They never give you the idea of like what. Could he control all computers when he gets? That would be definitely something.
That's what I thought they were going for. Am I wrong about that?
I don't know, because they never set out the stakes of what's going to happen. Because at the end, the stakes become, oh, no, he's going to bring a whole army of computer people into the other world. They kind of conquer the world.
Right.
Basically. Again, but those stakes aren't laid out until the very, very end, when they're basically at the portal, right? At the end.
Well, they have the Attack of the Clones scene where they see the clone factory. Oh, my God.
Yeah. Yes, they do. So like that whole thing, I'm like, okay, whatever. Then he goes into the whole ISO thing, which again is another like, okay, let's go back and let's go into like our cutscene, our video game cutscene, like flashback things.
You're saying this and I'm like, oh, I can't disagree with any of that.
Again, I don't mind this stuff getting dispersed, but I just wish that they hadn't done the thing where it was like, okay, now we're literally gonna sit down at a table and I'm gonna just tell you everything about what's happened and everything that could possibly go wrong.
If nothing else, it's the last time they do this, right? It's the first and last time we have like an exposition dump, and then the rest of it is like pure, race to the finish, as I said, quest narrative, chase movie kind of thing, except for that one scene that I really want to talk about when they're on the transport together. And I love that moment so much. Like that's actually my favorite moment in the movie, and it's like not even, it's probably the least Tron thing about it in some sense, but pays off the father-son stuff really nicely. And it's a very human moment in this sort of very cold, like, I knew watching the original Tron and watching this one, we're not in this for the human story at all. So, as much as I was joking about how much I enjoy NCOM and all that, like, I was never fully invested in that in the way I get invested in most movies on an emotional human sort of level. But when you have a great actor like Jeff Bridges, and I am a sucker, I'm a dad, you're a dad, father-son stuff, father-daughter stuff, I am a sucker for that. That works for me. I'll cry during Big Fish and Field of Dreams and all that stuff. And if you even approach that, like, this movie's clearly not on that level with any of that stuff, but it's an estranged father and son coming back together, and I think we know right from the get-go that they're going to be separated again, probably forever and ever. That's
Jeff Bridges ain't doing a third Tron movie.
Sure, absolutely. and yeah,
he's about to get his second Oscar nomination in like 2 years. All right, he's not doing a third Tron movie.
I'm glad he came back for this. Yeah,
me too. I think he's great in it. I think he's great. What I love about the performance is just that, like you were saying before, it's not what you expect. Every single moment that he speaks, I'm like, I have no idea what you're going to do right now.
Yeah.
And that is a wonderful thing to experience, especially in a big budget movie.
It is.
Like this.
Well, he still gets to be Jeff Bridges. Like, I was afraid he was going to be Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi.
Well, do we want to have we can have an argument about The Last Jedi another time.
No, I know. That's fine. I just, not even that. Leave them sorry, bad example. I know I touched a nerve there. But like, you could see, like, he's in this computer and in the grid for that many years. Like, what's that going to do to him? Like, it would have been fun if he was Colonel Kurtz. Like, that was a direction that would have been interesting to go in. Or he's just turned into this like digital hippie. I really like that. I like that choice better, I think, than him being just grizzled or just messed up in the mind and stuff like that. Like, he's just so much fun, but also I feel like he does still have a lot of his real humanity left. And, in the original movie, as much as I like the Kevin Flynn character, it's not like we see him with his family. We see him with, his ex-girlfriend and computer people, corporate associates. And in this movie, I think there is a little bit more depth to that character, and probably that's because of Jeff Bridges a lot more than it is because of the script. But there are some nice moments here that I wasn't expecting.
Well, there's that moment in the Michael Sheen nightclub scene where he comes in, he looks like a Jedi, and he like does some ass kicking, right? Yeah. And then you would expect in a movie like this and be like, all right, let's get out of here. But he goes, I think it's time to go, man.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is A+. Like, this is making the movie so much better. It's elevating the movie in so many ways. The scene I do like when they're sitting down to dinner and they have like a weird, like, sort of like, oh, I haven't seen you in a long time, Dad, and we're gonna have an awkward family dinner. I think that concept is really interesting, right? And the part where, he says, I dropped out of college, and she laughs. Kosinski said that wasn't in the script. She, Jeff Bridges made her laugh in that moment, and they kept it in because they were like, this is great, because she's like, she doesn't really know how to have human conversations. She doesn't know, and it's like one of those happy accident sort of moments that can happen with actors. And especially happen with an actor like Bridges, who seems like, apparently by all accounts, a very generous actor who is like really in it for like the movie to be as best as it can, and not necessarily for him to get all his flowers or whatever in things.
And props to Joseph Kosinski for understanding who he's working with here, and knowing that Jeff Bridges is going to carry that scene, and, that people are going to have the reaction to him that you and I have had, right? So, like, just let him rip, right? Like, for a first-time director, like, you've started a job before and be like, okay, I got to do everything by the book, and I'm not going to let things get out of my control and things like that. And he has that filmmaker's instinct where it's like, okay, this actor is going to be a major creative force in this movie. And like, literally everything he does makes it better. I agree. I think 51 on Metacritic is a little low for this movie. I'd put it somewhere in the 60s or something. This movie's a 6 for me.
It's a gentleman's 6, exactly.
It's a gentleman's 6 for sure. Yeah. Without Jeff Bridges, I don't even know. I don't know if I could have even made it through it.
Yeah. No, I agree.
I would have looked at it like a half hour of just like taking in the visuals, maybe. But beyond that, I don't think I could have gotten at all invested in this. And then you get to that barge scene, and I'm like emotionally, like, I'm not going to say I welled up, but I was like one step away from that. Like, I think it's a really beautiful moment, and who knows what that was in the script, right? I did not read the script for Tron Legacy, but I gotta imagine a lot of that just had to do with the performance.
There's nothing in this movie, and again, for a first-time filmmaker, this is very rare. There's nothing in this movie that feels like it was like the easy decision visually to do.
Yeah.
Right? Everything has some sort of framing or filter or something around it that makes it a little bit different than the standard thing would be. Even like that opening thing where they're doing like the news reports of him going missing and they're showing like those like TVs or whatever in like that CG space. Like that is way more than they had to do for that scene. It could have just been full screen, old looking news reports, right? But they didn't do it that way, which I thought was pretty interesting. We then get this muddied thing where it's like, okay, like what is everyone's goal at this point, right? Like Garrett Hedlund's goal is to get out, you know, and then he can delete Clue or whatever from like the outside or whatever. Jeff Bridges doesn't want to move because he's scared to lose the disc. And then like, oh God, what is her name?
Cora.
You know, she just is like, I guess I'm going to help Sam for whatever reason, right? And she sends him on his way.
She has feelings for him.
She does have feelings for him. Again, this is one of the very classic Hollywood thing where it's like, I don't know, this is the first normal person I've ever seen. We didn't even talk about, oh my God, what's his name? The guy who plays like Clue's assistant guy, who is just designed
like a B-movie villain.
Like, yes, and I love it.
Yeah.
James Frayne is the actor's name as Jarvis.
That shield he wears, the helmet with the face mask,
yes.
The glass sort of shield that only covers like the middle part of his face. It's the worst design choice in the movie, but also it fits really nicely, I think.
Absolutely. So like she sends him on his way, and then we get a little bit of this thing I wish we kind of got a little bit more of, which is the sort of like clandestine on the streets of, I don't know, Tron City or whatever, whatever it's called. I think that stuff looks really nice, and I think like it's interesting. And I know there's a lot of that in the original movie, like a lot of sneaking around.
Well,
like,
right.
places.
And there's like one scene where they kind of go to a city where the programs kind of interact with each other in a very human-like way. I mean, like the suspension of disbelief in this entire franchise, right? Like, it's this world that is so much like our world for absolutely no reason at all. But again, I like the way that that's evolved in this movie as opposed to the first one. You could have more NPCs in a video game in 2010 than you could in 1982. So that's kind of what they do here.
But I also think it is because, and I think to the movies, the smart thing about the underlying thing of the movie is that it is Clue trying to create something that his master would like, right? Which is he fills it with things that he thinks are familiar to him, right? Which is buildings and there's people and, they kind of have a societal structure that is analogous to something on Earth. And I think that very much is like this sort of artificial intelligence trying to recreate like reality. And much like generate an image on, OpenAI, it gets a little messed up when you try to do it.
Yeah.
The eyes are a little messed up when you try to create a person or whatever. So
I think if the movie had done something to me, like I'm somewhat convinced by what you're saying by this, but I don't really think we get a good sense of that from either of these movies.
Yeah, I mean, I only say because I think like, he has that scene at the end where he's like, you told me to make the perfect system.
Right, but why would the perfect system ever, like, there is nothing more imperfect than and that idea is addressed in this movie, right? So like the computer world should be nothing like the real world because the real world is nothing but chaos at all times. Whereas, the computer world could be nothing. The grid could be just that, like pure precision in every possible way. And yet, we've got all these like goofy, quirky characters kind of hanging out there and having these little comedic interactions in this world, culminating in the Michael Sheen character, who is the wildest thing in this movie. Also one of the most fun things in this movie. Boy, is this guy chewing scenery.
I love Michael Sheen. I love Michael Sheen so much. And Michael Sheen will often give you a little slice of ham, right? He'll give you a little slice of ham in his performances. When he's not doing like the super serious stuff, like obviously legendary. He's a legendary theater actor. He's legendary. He's one of the greatest theater actors of his generation. But he does a lot of genre movies, right? Which will happen to a lot of British, thespians. They get brought over and they end up doing a lot of genre movies.
Which has got to be a lot of fun. You got a fun break from the norm.
He fucking loves it. You could tell he loves it. He's not slicing off a little bit of ham here. He's took the whole pig and he made a fucking 7-foot long sub out of it. And he's eaten the whole thing during this scene. And I could not be more on board. It's a shot in the arm for the movie in this moment, right? It's like...
Well, it's like just when the movie's getting goofy in a way that I sort of don't enjoy, then it goes goofy in a way that I really do enjoy, where you get Michael Sheen basically playing David Bowie as in this, Casablanca sort of club environment that somehow exists in this world for some reason.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say before is like, and to compare it to another, obviously great all-time film, Age of Ultron, it is a similar concept, right? In that movie, which I think is kind of smart about a very messy movie that is that Ultron, wants the world to be perfect, but he can't be perfect because he was created by a person, right? Who imbued him with the characteristics of that person, right? And I think it's the same thing here. Right, where Clue is just as much Flynn as he is computer program.
Right, and with the AI thing, right? Like AI is what it's drawing on now is human artwork, and we'll get into that discussion maybe some other time and some other discussion. But it's like the idea that the AI is not creating anything so much as it's iterating on something that already exists. So like, what would this guy be like? Well, here's David Bowie, it's Ziggy Stardust. And that's exactly, I think that's a really interesting idea that I don't know if it was entirely intentional on the part of this movie, but it works. And boy, does it allow, as we were saying, for him to just have so much fun. Like,
he's having so much fun.
I wish he was in more of this movie.
Me too.
There's no way to get him, I guess, into more of this story. And as I said, the pacing is really great, but
yeah,
he's so much fun. He's just like mesmerizing on screen the entire time. I want him and Jeff Bridges in more scenes together.
Yes, for sure.
I like, for all the failings of this script, if they could have just gotten those two guys to do a couple of more things, then I probably would have forgiven a lot of the other stuff.
And this is what I mean. Like, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, because we're going to talk about the kind of directors we're going to talk about. We're going to be running into a lot of these type of movies, right? Like genre movies that are sort of like, not like the AAA tier of franchise movies, but somewhere in like the middle. There are just actors. Michael Sheen is one of those actors, and it's because he's classically trained, because he's the theater actor, who just knows what he understands the assignment of the movie that he is in. Another set of movies, the Twilight movies, he's in those movies, and he's doing the same freaking thing in those movies. His scenes are the most enjoyable things in all of those movies, because he is just like, I'm here, and I'm gonna just chew up the film camera at the amount I'm gonna mug during these scenes. And this, he's like, look, I know, like, look where I am, look how I'm dressed. I'm not here to win an Oscar. I'm not here to be taken seriously. I'm here so in 15 years, two people will be like, I wish there was more Michael Sheen in this movie. and that's exactly what he is, right? He double crosses them, which is great. I love a double, triple cross. Give me as many of those as possible. This will come up a lot of times in a lot of movies that we talk about, hopefully. The more crosses that happen in a movie, the more I'm in, right? So he double crosses these people. We get a double cross too from the woman who helps dress Sam in that first scene.
The sirens, yeah. That's a really interesting moment that we kind of just didn't talk about because it doesn't do much for the movie at all, but it looks really for like very attractive Joseph Kosinski car commercial sort of women that like emerge from the walls and like suit Sam up for his first gladiatorial combat in the grid. Yeah, I loved that. I don't want to give this movie too much credit but like there are some very Kubrick images in this movie, like the symmetry of some of the compositions, the white on white kind of thing that it does a lot of times, and the color, the aesthetic design. As I mentioned before, I feel like the lair of Flynn is just that hotel set from 2001, which of course is like an iconic, beautiful, amazing, like rip that off as many times as you want, because very few things in a movie are ever going to be as cool as that. So I really like that, and I love those moments. But yeah, it's they at least bring her back for something, which is nice. Yeah.
And again, not to put internal logic on this thing, but I'm like, it seemed like in that first scene, she just existed to live in this like chamber and then come out and help people get dressed for these games.
No, apparently that's just her job. And then she just hangs out at the club off hours.
She's off her shift. She gets to just walk around the streets and go to this club, which is fine. I just, everyone deserves a private life.
Computer programs, they need downtime.
They do. Everyone needs, you get burned out. If you just keep working, you're going to get burned out. I should mention the Flynn's house and then this are both sets. They're both big, giant, like intricate sets, which you can 100% tell.
Yep.
It really shows, and it really, like you said, it gives that tactile feeling to this sort of computer world, which, like you said, was not something they had to do, but it seems to me Kosinski really wanted to do, which was to build a lot of sets and to have it feel as real as possible whenever he could. This, I think, is the best like hand-to-hand sort of like fight scene in the movie. I think it's better than the disc fight at the beginning.
It is, but it feels like it kind of comes from another movie. As I was saying that before, like it's so not the Tron world, you know. It's just like it's punching and kicking and throwing and, you know, wire work and stuff like that. And like there's so much that you could do here, but I don't know. I mean, it is a real
part of
set.
that's part of like the magic of it, right? Is the fact that it's like it's this crazy digital world, but it's like it's very tactile, right? I think that is sort of like the vibe of this. And Daft Punk is in this scene, we should say. If you
they make a fun little cameo in this movie. I'm glad to know it was actually Daft Punk. I mean, I thought it was cool they were making a cameo, but like literally you could put those helmets on anybody.
It's true.
You're like, oh, that's Daft Punk. Sure.
No, it was actually them. The double cross or the fight, Flynn comes and saves them in this thing. Like Michael Sheen, a little yoink, steals Flynn's disc as they're going down the elevator. Cora gets hurt during this. She gets
her
almost
arm cut
derezed.
off,
Yeah. She's kind of down for the count here. Flynn does some like weird like God stuff to stop the elevator, but then they're kind of like, okay, so I guess now we're off on thing. And I do kind of like that. Like again, it's the scripting is kind of rote, but Bridges is very good in this scene because he's selling like, no, dude, like you fucked up. like why did you do this? You know.
Again, a nice little father-son moment. Like, my dad and I have had conversations like that. Before I forget, also the exterior of this is so cool looking.
Very cool. Yeah,
it's this. It's like a skyscraper. It's like hundreds and hundreds of feet up into the virtual sky of this, and there's like almost a bird's head at the top of it, which is where the club is, and then the elevator that goes down this very, very long sort of, you know, it's like this very narrow, like just a, you know, it reminds me a lot of, I don't know if you're into this kind of stuff, but I love like 70s, early 80s, late 60s era sci-fi novels, the covers of them.
Oh yeah,
like
I love
that kind of artwork. Had kind of that sort of feel, which is a little bit different from the rest of the aesthetic of this movie, but kind of works in this scene. And, you know, again, even when I'm not super invested in the story, and that's a lot of this movie for me, there's always something cool to look at. Like there is always something where it's like, oh, that's something I'm going to remember. You know, you texted me like just a still, I didn't even know what scene that was from.
It's the
like,
very end. It's like the very end before they go to the portal.
That's awesome looking. Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing looking. It's amazing looking. And just stuff like, you know, they like the fact that those discs they're physical objects. Like that shot at the beginning, right, where like it's like a rack focus through the disc, or whatever. It looks fucking great, and it would not look as good if it was not a physical object, right, in the world in that moment. And what I love about the building though is that there's the only thing in the skyscraper is the club. It's just it's like a 1,000-foot high building that has one room, which is a nightclub. So we get the double cross. We get our first kind of like really digital Jeff Bridges has been out of the movie for quite a long time at this point.
Yeah.
He pops back in at this point to sort of get the disc from Michael Sheen's character, blows up Michael Sheen, which is just a trap. If I could forgive Clue for everything else, I can't forgive him for blowing up Michael Sheen in the moment. And like that scene again, like it's a pretty good, like the animation and, you know, stuff in his eyes and stuff is pretty good in that moment. Him playing it in that moment, I think the digital thing doesn't bother me as much because it feels like it's supposed to be a computer program. And then we're off on the barge to the portal.
Which there's a scene like that is a direct sort of homage or copy of something in the first movie where there's this long sort of linear track that they're on a similar kind of vehicle. Looks cooler in this one in the way most things in this movie kind of just evolve, as we've said, things from the original. And you get this like really beautiful moment as like, just it's young love, which I was not really expecting out of this movie, and just the shots of Jeff Bridges like being really, really, really human in this moment, and just the sort of philosophical idea of that, you know, that really kind of hit me in here. That like, you know, this guy is really, he's part of the computer now. He's transhuman. He's digital now more than he is tangible, more than he is physical, and yet he has this very sort of emotional, very common sort of moment where like that's my son and like he's in love and like you two crazy kids, like you're gonna go out in the real world and change the world and I'm gonna be stuck here in this computer. And you know, there's like I mentioned it kind of before, but like there's almost like this fatalism about his character, and like no matter what, you know he's not getting out of there. You know he's probably going to die by the end of this. Jeff Bridges is an older, you know, he's obviously still alive and still making movies, and I hope we have him for a very long time. But there is this sense in this movie that I think it does really well of the passage of time. You know, just the arcade is a great example of that. You know, the plastic over the old arcade machines and that kind of thing. So I don't know, like maybe I was reading way too much into this. Maybe it's not as good of a scene as I wanted it to be, but I felt like very, very moved by this. And Bridges is just so good here. Like I'm sure he has kids, right? Like he's got to be an actual dad. It just felt very, very human and very real, and just a nice scene. And it slows down the pace of the movie a little bit, but I don't mind it all here. And we know we only have a little bit left, and we're kind of heading into the grand finale, and we needed, like, I know, as I said before, you don't go into this for the human story, but like just for this one literally shining moment, like most of this movie is this sparkly sort of setting, and the track that they're on, and I just really, really liked all of it. You know, it's I guess it's the most Lord of the Rings moment in this movie. Like it works for me so much, and the fact that Kosinski and that Tron Legacy were able to achieve that, even if just for this couple of minutes here, pretty impressive. And like, I don't know, Garrett Hedlund and Olivia Wilde are very good in this scene also.
Because this is they're playing a real emotion here, right? They have a real emotion and stakes to play in this scene.
Yeah, and this is the one time I really, Cora, like Olivia Wilde's character, it's the one time I'm kind of invested in her a little bit too, and like what she might actually be feeling. Like one of the problems, not necessarily a problem, but like I'm watching that first movie, and there's these relationships. There's the guy who's like totally in love with Flynn. He's a computer pro. He's clearly, even though this guy's just a computer program, he's in love with Flynn. And then he dies, and it's supposed to be this emotional moment because we kind of like this character, and he's fun, and clearly he's just, you know, if nothing, he's a very, very close friend, or wants to be a very, very close friend of Flynn. But there's no stakes to that because he's just not real, you know, and we never get out of that mindset in the first movie that these are just computer programs. So when they die, they just, you know, it's like deleting something off of your hard drive or something. And for a couple of moments in Tron Legacy, and I'm glad they didn't push this too hard because I think it could have gotten very out of hand and very cheesy. But right here, we do kind of feel that humanity of it. And I really just like that.
You can't have a 2 hour and 10-minute long blockbuster and any movie and not have some sort of investment in characters in some point and it have it work. Right. You know, that's
what makes Spielberg brilliant.
Yeah. And that's what makes all the people who are really good at this what they are, you know. It's why, you know, in the Lord of the Rings movies, every giant vista is counterpointed with a close-up of small personal stakes, right? That's how you make these scenes matter. People, once you get to a big enough size or you abstract things enough, people can't identify with those kind of stakes, right? You need people stakes. And I feel like I saw this in IMAX, right? And this scene, there's that one close-up of Olivia Wilde, right? Where she's kind of taking it all in. And her eyes are like a special effect. She has some of the most amazing eyes I think I've ever seen in my life. And they're so big and so expressive. And when she's able to play that stuff with some reality, it's really, really effective. You know, and I think this is one of the really only scene where she gets to do that, where it's not like a joke. Yeah. Right. Or some sort of heightened experience. But you're right. It is Bridges kind of being like, hey, this is no longer my time. Right. This is their time now. So that helps him make the decision, which obviously they Chekhov gunned it earlier where she's like, well, he could, only we could get rid of clues if he reconstituted with him and that would kill him. You know, so you know it's coming. Right. They don't bring that up. You don't bring up that gobbledygook sentence earlier in the movie for it not to come back.
Well, Disney will kill off a parent.
You need scenes like this, like Avengers Endgame. You need Steve and Natasha eating a peanut butter sandwich with each other. You know, like that's where really the stakes really come from. Yeah. The stakes don't come from you going like the world is gonna end. Because, like, I don't know what that means, man. Like, I can't, like, that doesn't...
I mean, even though now we kind of do.
Well, yes, we do. So after this, we have, like you said, the Attack of the Clones, like, type scene. Again, this is where sometimes I feel like, and this 2010, it's still modern movie making. You're like, man, you don't need this scene where she gets taken. We could have gone right to the portal from here. Like, this scene you're giving me, we haven't even mentioned the whole Rensler thing. This thing where it's like, oh, who's this mysterious... character who holds 2 discs like Tron always held.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know, maybe it's Tron, but there's no emotional stake. This is the one thing where it fails, right? Where it's like they want it to be a reveal when you finally hear like Bruce Boxleiter's voice.
Yeah.
Go like, I live for the users or whatever. And I'm like,
I fight for the users.
I fight for the users.
Not like there's a couple of like dialogue callbacks to the original movie. Yeah, this I agree with you. This doesn't work at all. Like,
it doesn't work at all.
And this should be the thing. I mean, I don't know. There should be emotional stakes around this, right? Like, this is the real connection to the first movie. Yeah, like, not knowing anything about that first movie, I didn't realize, like, I thought the whole thing was Tron. I didn't realize Tron was
of course.
An individual, a program, right?
Yeah.
That fights for the users, whatever. And like, that's what kind of saves the world in the original movie. And here it's like, he's kind of revealed in a very perfunctory sort of way and then is off so quickly. I mean, like, we get a couple of minutes with him and it's like, I can't wait to see Tron do something awesome. And then he's just like sinking into the ocean.
I mean, you don't get him back until he's already on that plane at that point. And then it's like, okay, it's just a weird ADR voiceover of Boxleiter saying that line. And then we don't even get to see Tron do Tron stuff. Like,
right. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
If you want this to be effective, it has to be a plot point throughout the movie and then built up and then revealed earlier where he kind of turns earlier or turns right at the end when like Clue's about to make it to the portal.
The final battle, right. He has no bearing on that whatsoever. Yeah.
Yeah. The dogfighting thing is cool, but that's the one action scene where geographically I cannot clock where they are, what's going on, who's who, because they're both in just orange. They're both wearing helmets in orange gliders,
Clue's is yellow, which is one shade away from orange. Yeah, they tried. They something.
It's too similar. Tron should have turned back blue or something after he turned good again, or I got his memories back, or whatever, something. So that was the one big failing, I think, of the movie, as far as like a thing they tried to do, which they really, really failed at, I think was that.
I did like the sequence. That was the moment. I mean, throughout the entire thing, I was like, man, I wish I had seen this in 3D. And that was like, oh man, I wish I had seen this in 3D and like D-Box or something like that. Like, that would be a lot of fun. I love aerial combat sequences in movies, flying sequences in movies. I love that stuff. I'm a huge, huge sucker for that. That's probably going to come out over the course of this show. Just like, our little things that like anytime you see them, it's like, oh, that's really cool. I'm glad they did that there. So like, I love Dunkirk did such a great job with that. Like, any of that stuff, I just enjoy it a lot.
I do like them stealing the plane. Like, I think, and it's mostly because I like the way Bridges acts during that whole scene.
Yeah.
Well, where he's just kind of like, he's just like, come on, man, let's go.
Yeah. Well, the whole thing, like even the clone factory, like this is all sort of World War II spy movie stuff, right? It's the Nazi base and they steal it. It's very Raiders of the Lost Ark, kind of that sort of feel, that kind of adventure serial kind of stuff. But yeah, this scene is a little bit pointless, but it looks really cool.
It does look cool. Again, the aesthetic of it is unimpeachable. You throw those lights with this black kind of background and I'm in because it looks great.
Yeah. I like the digital ocean too. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but this sort of like ocean of blackness that you can kind of see it, but you can't really see it. It's hard to describe, but it's a great sort of aesthetic choice. Another one. But yeah, I wish the scene kind of culminated in more than just like setting up the final scene. It's a mini boss before the final boss.
It's definitely the transitional cut scene. You fight the first stage of the boss.
Yep.
And then it transitions into the final phase of the boss. The final scene, I think it plays out just basically exactly how you would assume it would play out when it started. Bridges is going to stay behind to let his son and his new girlfriend escape. And I think they want to play it like, isn't it? It's unbelievable. She's going to escape, right? And I'm like, no, it's just obvious. I do like the conversation between Clue and Flynn. What do I have to do to impress you type of vibe. I wish there had been more of that seeded throughout the movie, right? I think that is more interesting in a lot of ways than some of the other stuff they try to play. This whole idea of like the rivalry between Clue and Sam, I think would have been more interesting than just like, I'm just going to kill you because you're a person. I don't like people.
Yeah.
The fact that you are the biological son of the father of my like digital father or whatever. And I feel in competition with you, I think is a more interesting dynamic than just, I want to get out and rule the world.
Yeah, that's thematically interesting too. And like every time this movie starts to go in a direction that does have a little bit of that like thematic, philosophical, like kind of a deeper subtext about it, it's like, nope, we got to just end this thing. This is a $200 million Disney blockbuster, and we're just not going to go there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the problem too is like, right, we've talked about Garrett Hedlund not being that great in it. Once he finds the dad, he doesn't really have a thing he's trying to overcome anymore. Right. He has like a plot thing he needs to do, which is get to this place, and there's people in his way, but he has no emotional thing to get over at that point.
Well, right, because he basically assumed for however many years, 20 years or whatever, that his father was dead. And I don't know. I mean, I guess it could have done more with that, but are we maybe asking too much out of Tron Legacy?
All I'm asking is like, I'm asking kind of like give me simple pieces that just get me to the place you want me to get to, right? That's all I'm asking for.
Yeah.
You know, and the thing is like, I do think the movie we've mentioned a couple times has some interesting thematic ideas that it's sort of bringing up. It seems to be like gesturing like, well, this is sort of interesting, right? Like, what makes you a person, or what is this, or what's that? And then it sort of like pushes them down for this other stuff. And if it hadn't brought that stuff up, I might have been like, okay, well, it's just a fun, like, whatever. But I think there's more interesting things happening here under the surface than the movie is giving the time to. And I will say, I've praised Kosinski most of the way through for his geography of scenes and all this kind of stuff. This ending thing where they're getting separated, it falls apart completely, because I'm like, Sam is literally standing 6 inches away from the portal.
Yep.
and they do like 7 shot reverse shots, and he basically has moved back a millimeter every time. He's like, no, we can't let him get here. I'm like, just go in the fucking portal, dude.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing?
Or just have it like extend behind, like, you know, this should be a much more sort of like adaptable world. It kind of stays the way it is. Yeah, you got me thinking now too. Like, they were going to do a sequel that directly followed this one, but like, would that be Sam's movie? Like, I don't think I need another.
It would 100% have been Sam's. It would have been Sam and Cora's movie.
Yeah, like, who is that character? Like, we'll get to it. We're almost there. When they actually conclude this thing and they go back into the real world, I kind of like what they did there. In fact, particularly the last moment of this is really, again, another beautiful, unexpected grace note in it. But yeah, like I would not be excited. I'm kind of glad I saw this knowing that there wasn't going to be a sequel that was just like Sam not with his dad, like without Flynn, without Kevin Flynn there, he's nothing.
Cillian Murphy would have theoretically been the villain of that movie, which would have been at least interesting, you know, or one of the villains. But I would have rather been like, what is Bruce Boxleiter doing in the grid? Because that's where Sam basically sends him. And I'm like, okay, I get that Clue's gone, but you are sending him into like, I don't know, a lawless gladiator zone at this point. They're like, there's nobody in charge anymore over there. When he sort of like gives him the coin and tells him to go to the arcade at the end.
Yeah.
And she got there's a scene where they're driving the motorcycle and she's kind of hugging him or whatever. And I think that is like a sweet way to end, an unexpected way to end a movie like this.
Well, it is. And I really like, so we're in the city, whatever, this sort of undefined city where these movies take place. But the very, like, it's a bunch of tracking shots. They're on the motorcycle together. Motorcycle obviously is kind of coded in the Tron world, the light cycles and all that stuff. But the very last couple of moments here, they're like in a forest, and like literally everything we see is organic. Like, there are no lights, there is no city, there's no anything, but like, this is the real world. This is nature. And he's bringing her into this, like, again, not the most, like, it's a pretty obvious choice, but like, that is not something this movie needs to do, right? Like, they talk about the sunrise. It's a sunrise or sunset. I think it's a sunrise. She's like, what's a sunrise look like? And so the end of the movie, the obvious Disney ending of the movie is he shows her a sunrise, cut to credits, right? Instead, we see the sunrise, and then we go into like this purely organic sort of nature world. And I really liked that. They kind of allowed this one little, like, nice little, like I said, grace note at the end of this. And little things like that do impress me. But I might be just very easily impressed.
Yeah, well, again, we're at the end of the movie. I think a strong debut from Joseph Kosinski, for sure. Found a lot of stuff in here that I wasn't expecting to find. Yeah. Especially in the research, found a lot of stuff that kind of points to a more interesting, involved filmmaker than I was kind of expecting. I think when you're hearing this, next week, we'll be talking about Oblivion, which really feels like his movie, right? A concept that he developed from the very beginning.
Which I am fascinated to see, right? Because I don't know what his storytelling, like I've seen 2 movies of his. They're both these Lego sequels or whatever, and I was a big Top Gun fan, and I liked Maverick a lot, but so like clearly he's that guy. He's the filmmaker you call in to do the 20 years later follow up to either a moderately popular cult movie or like, the biggest blockbuster of the 80s kind of thing. But to sort of see what his own ideas are and where his real interests lie in Oblivion, I think that seems like it's going to be really fascinating for me. But
and we get to talk about Cruzy for the first time.
Yeah, that's a beginning of a beautiful friendship there.
Yeah. So in intersection between those two people in that movie. And, I think we're going to discover a lot about how Tom Cruise really changed his career. Just to go over a little ending stuff for Tron Legacy. It opened on December 17th, 2010. It earned $43.6 million in its opening weekend. And it would go on to gross $172 million in North America and $400 million worldwide. And it made about $61 million in home video, a hit, right? For a relaunch of a 20-plus-year-old franchise that was a cult franchise, I think a pretty good return, right?
Yeah.
And Disney kind of immediately goes like, okay, we're going to do a third Tron movie, like for sure. Like the Kosinski came back, they brought the writers back, they were writing it. I think it kicked around in about 2015. And they canceled it. And I think the reason why it doesn't get made, I think he said this himself, is that on December 31st, 2009, Disney buys Marvel. That completely changes what movies Disney is going to make, but also their perspective on what success looks like for a big budget movie, right?
For sure, yeah.
Because immediately, basically, not a couple years later, The Avengers comes out and the whole movie landscape is shifted. At that point, they've got young men. They're not worried about making these types of movies anymore. So that's what happens with that. I think its legacy is pretty interesting. Because it's one of the first. It's not the first, but I feel like it's one of the first ones to really crystallize the whole Lego sequel thing in a lot of ways. Comes out right around the time, I think, the year after Abrams' Star Trek movie comes out. Right, which is probably the first of these, but of course this is already well into production when J.J. Abrams' Star Trek movie comes out. So yeah, any final thoughts on Tron Legacy, Nick?
No, I like you said, I think it's a great example. I think he was a good choice for this show to start off with, and there are a lot of faults in this movie. I don't think he's responsible for many of them, So I do, had I seen this back in the day and had I known like this was a director that I wanted to follow, I would be very interested to see what he did next. I'd be very interested, as I said, to see what he did with an original concept of his own, where he wasn't kind of playing in this franchise world, particularly for a company like Disney that kind of puts their boundaries on things the way they always have and always will. So I'm interested, just if I knew nothing else about him, if I had only seen this movie, I'd be very interested to see what else he was capable of. And certainly, in the sci-fi genre, certainly in that like big budget sort of realm, like anything could sort of happen with this filmmaker here. And there's nothing about this that just screams like corporate product at me. The script in some ways does, but like his contributions to it are, no pun intended, they're very organic, right? Like they are, like it feels like there's humanity. Even this this franchise, this whole property is all about the opposite of that. It's this very cold sort of cinematic world, and yet he brings a human touch to it. I don't know. Now I just sound cheesy, but I don't know. I feel like his personality, and I see his directorial stamp. I see his signature on this in a lot of ways, and that makes it really interesting. And I think we're gonna hopefully encounter that a lot along the way. So, again, your choice for the first filmmaker to talk about, your choice for the first movie to talk about. Really good choice.
I mean, we came to the agreement together. We had a couple of ideas. I won't take all the credit for it.
I would have never thought of him, though. You were the one who brought up Joseph Kosinski first. And I was like, oh, yeah, that guy. He made Top Gun Maverick. Let's do it.
Yeah. The thing I'm fascinated by going forward is we've seen the visual style. We've seen the fact that he is able to kind of really compose a frame really nicely. I'm going to be interested to see how his actors perform in his movies, outside of the people who are just like, that they can do a great performance no matter who's directing them, right? Those are the people I'm interested in. That I'm a very big actor performance kind of person when it comes to movies. And so that's the thing I'm really going to key in on as we go forward. Very simple way to get in touch with us. intrepidfilmographers.substack.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast. You can find whatever videos we're making, any writing we might do, anything that we decide to put up there. We'll also have all our socials on there where you can follow us. Of course, you can subscribe to the podcast on whatever podcast app you love to use. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. If you use Amazon for some reason, all of those things, just make sure you rate and review us. It really, really helps. If you love talking about movies, we'd love to have you. That's pretty much my thought about all of this. Next time we will be discussing Oblivion, starring Mr. Tom Cruise. So I'm excited. I haven't seen it, so I'm excited to watch it and talk about it. But Nick, thank you so much for going on this journey with me.
Into the grid.
Into the grid. Biodigital jazz, man.
Digital jazz.